Hello, friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if you're enjoying these stories, a like helps more than you would think. And if you want more nights like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch. I will not mention it again tonight. What I would love to know is where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're in a quiet bedroom in Phoenix, Arizona, with the air conditioner humming steadily on the other side of the wall. Maybe you're somewhere in Manchester, England, with a fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to move the warm night air around. Maybe you're lying in the dark in Toronto with the window cracked open, waiting to see if a breeze ever actually comes. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. All right, love. Pull the blanket up just enough to feel covered, the way you would if someone else were tucking it there for you. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. Forget the ballroom you're picturing right now, the wide one. Fifth Avenue in 1893, chandeliers doubled in gilt mirrors, 400 names on a list that decided who mattered in America and who did not. A woman in ivory satin turning slowly under candlelight while a string orchestra plays something by Strauss. That is the version everyone gives you. The portrait version, where the diamonds catch the light just so, and everyone is smiling. And nothing has ever gone wrong in the history of that house. We are going to the room behind it tonight. The small one, with one lamp lit instead of 100. A room at the back of a Fifth Avenue mansion, past the main staircase, past the rooms anyone is permitted to see. A dressing room, a little after midnight, the ball already over, the guests already gone home in their carriages with the horse's breath fogging in the cold. Not the gas fixtures on the wall, which throw too much light and too many shadows, but a single oil lamp turned low on the dressing table, because the woman standing at the mirror does not want to be seen clearly right now, not even by herself. Maybe she's 34, with the kind of composure that took her a decade to build, and that she can still, on certain nights, feel slipping through her fingers like water. Maybe she is the wife of a man whose name appears in the newspapers with the word financier attached to it, a word that sounds solid and is not always. Maybe she is standing very still while her maid works at the laces of her corset, and there is a particular tightness to tonight's lacing, a half-inch more than usual, pulled and held and pinned in a way that has nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with arithmetic. A woman who is 11 weeks along and has told no one, not her husband, who is travelling, not her mother, who would not be able to keep the secret past breakfast, not even fully herself, not yet. Not until she's worked out what this means for the calendar of her season, for the wedding she's meant to host for her husband's niece in April, for the 6 months during which a lady of her position is simply not seen carrying. Because to be seen carrying too early, before the socially correct interval, invites a particular kind of arithmetic from other women. Women who know how to count backward from a wedding date, with the quiet efficiency of accountants. That is not the story anyone tells about the Gilded Age. Nobody paints that scene. But I want you to understand, before we go any further tonight, that this is closer to the truth of what it meant to be a woman inside that world than any ballroom ever was. Tonight is not really about the fortunes, the railroads, the steel mills, the copper mines, the banking houses that built those mansions stone by stone and window by window along Fifth Avenue and out along the Rhode Island shoreline at Newport. That story has been told 1,000 times, and it is a story about men, mostly, men and their ledgers and their ambitions. Tonight is about something quieter. It is about the labour, and I do mean labour, the constant, exhausting, unpaid, unacknowledged labour of concealment that women performed night after night, so that those fortunes would look untouched from the outside, so that nothing would ever seem to have gone wrong. There is a paradox sitting at the centre of that dressing room, and I want you to feel it rather than have me explain it, because I think if I just tell you, it will slide past you the way facts do late at night. So let me just leave it here, quietly, the way it would have sat in that room. The tighter the lacing, the safer the secret. The safer the secret, the more perfect the appearance. And the more perfect the appearance, the more completely alone the woman wearing it became. because a secret that cannot be spoken to anyone is a secret you carry entirely by yourself, in a room with one low lamp, at an hour when everyone else in the house is finally asleep. The maid does not ask questions. This is, I think, one of the more remarkable and least discussed relationships of the entire era. The one between a lady and the woman who dressed her, and we will come back to it more than once tonight, because it holds more of the real history than almost anything else I could show you. For now, know only this. The maid pulls the laces. The lady exhales, once, carefully, the way you learn to exhale when a full breath is no longer entirely available to you. And in the mirror, for just a moment, before she arranges her face back into its evening composure, something passes across her features that no portrait from this era ever captured. Not because painters lacked the skill, because no one ever sat for a portrait looking like that. That expression did not exist in public. It only existed here, in this room, at this hour, and it existed alone. Let us slow down now, and let me tell you how she got here, and what this world actually was, underneath all that guilt. The world she belonged to had a name, and the name mattered more than almost anything else in her life. New York society in the 1890s was not one thing. It was, at minimum, two competing kingdoms occupying the same streets, and understanding the war between them is the only way to understand why concealment became such an art form in the first place. On one side stood what everyone called old money, though the people who held it rarely used the phrase themselves, because using it would have implied there was any other kind worth mentioning. These were families like the Astors, whose fortune traced back to fur trading and Manhattan real estate, accumulated so early and so thoroughly that by the 1890s it had achieved a kind of geological permanence. The Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Schermerhorns. Names that carried weight not because the people attached to them were especially interesting, though some were, but because their money had been in the family long enough to have lost the smell of the making of it. That is really what old money meant when you strip away the mythology. It meant money old enough that nobody currently alive had watched it get earned. It had simply always been there, the way the Hudson River had simply always been there. And that permanence purchased something that raw wealth alone could never purchase, which was the assumption of belonging. Across from them, growing louder and richer and more impatient with every passing year, stood the families everyone called, sometimes to their faces and often not, the new money. The Vanderbilts, astonishingly, were considered new money well into the 1870s, despite controlling a fortune that dwarfed the Astors, because the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had made his money in his own lifetime, on steamboats and then railroads, and money made within living memory carried a whiff of commerce that old New York found genuinely distasteful. The Goulds, the Fisks, later the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, whose fortunes from steel and oil were so enormous they eventually could not be excluded from anywhere, though it took decades and a considerable amount of strategic marriage to accomplish that particular conquest. I find this distinction genuinely fascinating, and I want to sit with it a moment longer, because it explains almost everything else in our story tonight. A woman's social standing in this world was not simply a function of how much money her household held, it was a function of how long that money had been quiet. New money was loud by definition, because the making of it had been loud, visible, recent, and often more than a little ruthless. The families who held it had to spend enormous, almost theatrical sums to buy their way into rooms that old money entered simply by walking through the front door. This is, incidentally, the entire explanation for why the mansions along Fifth Avenue and out at Newport grew so absurdly large and so architecturally overwrought during exactly this period. A 125-room cottage at Newport, as the Vanderbilts insisted on calling their summer palace, was not built because anyone needed 125 rooms for a summer. It was built because the family building it needed 125 rooms worth of proof. The instrument that formalized all of this, the actual mechanism by which acceptance was granted or withheld, had a name too, and it is worth knowing, because it governed the daily reality of every woman in our story more completely than almost any law on the books. It was called the Social Register, a printed directory first published in New York in 1887, And it did something that sounds almost absurd when you say it plainly. It listed by name and address every family considered acceptable in fashionable society. To be omitted from a later printing, to have your name simply not appear 1 year after it had appeared the year before, was a social catastrophe that could take a decade to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Women studied it. Mother's Cross referenced it before approving a daughter's engagement. It was consulted with the same grim seriousness that a banker might apply to a credit report, because in a sense that is precisely what it was. And then there was the number itself, the one everyone still remembers even now, more than a century later, 400. The story, which is mostly but not entirely true, goes like this. Caroline Astor, known to everyone simply as Mrs. Astor, the undisputed empress of old New York society, held an annual ball each January that functioned as the single most important social event of the year, the one gathering that determined more than any other who counted and who did not. Her ballroom, in the mansion she shared with her husband on Fifth Avenue, could comfortably hold approximately 400 guests. Her social advisor, a man named Ward McAllister, is credited with observing that there were only about 400 people in New York who really mattered anyway, who would not, in his memorable and rather chilling phrase, feel out of place in a ballroom, or who might make other guests uncomfortable by their presence. The guest list for that January ball became, in effect, the closest thing New York had to an aristocracy, an unofficial, unelected, entirely self-appointed nobility whose membership was decided by one woman standing at the top of a staircase, deciding, name by name, who would be admitted through her doors. I want you to sit with how strange that actually is. A functioning, self-declared social monarchy operating inside a republic that had fought a revolution specifically to abolish the idea of inherited status, and yet here it was, reconstituted in silk and calling cards, governed by rules nobody had voted on and enforced with a rigour that would have impressed any royal court in Europe. Mrs. Astor herself seemed to understand the theatre of it perfectly. She dressed, quite deliberately, in the manner of royalty, favouring dark, rich fabrics, an enormous diamond stomacher across her bodice that had reportedly once belonged to Marie Antoinette, or was at least sold to her with that story attached, and a tiara worn, without any apparent irony, at private balls in a private house on a residential street in Manhattan. The woman in our dressing room, the one with the tightened corset and the 11 weeks she has told no one about, exists somewhere inside this hierarchy, and exactly where she sits inside it shapes everything about how dangerous her secret actually is. If her family is old money, secure, several generations settled, she has more room to manoeuvre, because her standing does not depend on a single evening's impression. If her family is newer, if her husband's fortune was made within the last 20 years, and the family is still, in the delicate language of the era, establishing itself, then every single gesture matters immeasurably more, because the ground beneath her has not yet hardened into permanence. A single scandal, a single well-timed rumour, could undo in a season what took a decade of careful manoeuvring to build. Let me tell you, because I think it will help you picture the whole apparatus more clearly, about the calling card, because almost nothing captures the strange, elaborate, silent choreography of this world quite as well as a small rectangle of engraved paper. A lady of standing did not simply visit another lady of standing. She left cards, according to a code so specific and so widely understood among women of her class that an entire chapter of every etiquette manual of the period was devoted to it, and women studied those chapters the way a modern professional might study a manual on contract law. The size of the card mattered. A married woman's card was slightly larger than an unmarried woman's. The engraving mattered, always engraved, never printed, because printed cards signalled a certain vulgar economy that a woman of real standing would never permit near her name. The corners mattered. A folded corner on a calling card carried an entire sentence's worth of meaning without a single word being written. A card with the upper right corner turned down meant the caller had come in person rather than sending the card by servant. A corner turned down on the left could indicate condolence, cards left after a death, cards left to announce a departure from town, cards left simply to acknowledge an acquaintance without seeking a real visit. Each had its own silent grammar, and a woman who misread that grammar, who left the wrong card folded the wrong way at the wrong house, could commit a social error large enough to be discussed, disapprovingly, at other women's tea tables for weeks afterward. And here is the part that I think reveals the real function of all this ritual, more than any etiquette manual ever admitted outright. The calling card system was not at its heart about politeness. It was a surveillance mechanism, gentle and lace-trimmed and entirely voluntary in appearance, through which women continuously monitored one another's social standing, tracked who was rising and who was falling, who was still being received and who had quietly, without any announcement at all, stopped being invited anywhere that mattered. A woman whose cards were not returned within the correct window of time, generally understood to be within a matter of days, knew immediately and with total clarity that something had shifted. Nobody would tell her what, nobody needed to. The silence itself was the message, precise and unambiguous and utterly deniable. Because how, after all, can you accuse someone of insulting you by declining to send a piece of paper? This, I think, is where we start to see the shape of the world our woman in the dressing room actually lived inside. Every gesture legible, every silence readable, every piece of paper, every fold of a corner, every hour a light stayed on in a window, potentially a signal that someone else in her circle was already quietly reading. Let us go back to the corset for a moment, because I think it deserves more of your attention than the fashion plates ever gave it, and because it will help you understand something important about how concealment actually worked in this world. It was never one single trick. It was a whole grammar of the body, learnt early and practiced daily, and the corset was really only the beginning of it. By the 1890s, corsetry had moved a considerable distance from the earlier Victorian styles our woman's mother might have worn. The fashionable silhouette of the decade demanded what dressmakers and corsetiers called the health corset, though the name was something of a joke even at the time. A longer, more rigid construction that produced the elegant S-curve so beloved of magazine illustrators. Chest forward, hips back, a posture that looked effortless in a fashion plate and felt, by most contemporary accounts, like a form of quiet, continuous discipline applied to the entire torso for 12 or 14 hours a day. Whalebone, or more precisely baleen, harvested from the mouths of right whales and bowhead whales in an industry that was, by this point in the century, driving certain whale populations toward collapse, though nobody at a Fifth Avenue dinner table was thinking about that while admiring a well-cut bodice. Steel boning increasingly common too, as manufacturing improved, lighter than whalebone in some constructions, heavier and more punishing in others. Here is what I find myself genuinely fascinated by, and what almost never makes it into the popular retelling of Gilded Age fashion. The corset was not simply decorative, it was functional in ways that had almost nothing to do with beauty and almost everything to do with information control. A skilled lady's maid, and every woman of real standing employed one, could lace a corset to disguise the earliest stages of pregnancy for a period of weeks, sometimes with careful management of dress cut and posture, for a couple of months beyond what a modern woman with modern maternity clothing would consider possible. This was not some rare, scandalous secret technique. It was simply understood quietly among women and their maids as one of the practical uses of the garment, alongside its more publicly acknowledged purposes of shaping the waist and supporting the bust. Why would concealment of pregnancy matter so much? This is worth sitting with, because the answer says a great deal about how tightly this world policed a woman's calendar. There was a socially prescribed window, understood by everyone though written down almost nowhere explicitly, during which a pregnancy following a wedding was considered entirely proper, and a window before which it was considered at minimum worth quiet comment, and at worst evidence of impropriety that could follow a young couple for years. Society women did the arithmetic constantly, automatically, the way you might glance at a clock without quite meaning to. A child born 8 months after a wedding invited murmured calculation at every tea table in the neighbourhood. Concealing the early months of a pregnancy, delaying the public announcement, buying time for the calendar to work in a woman's favour, was not vanity, it was self-preservation, practiced through fabric and lacing and posture. The body itself pressed into the work of managing a reputation, and it was not only pregnancy that the corset and the careful architecture of dress helped to hide. Weight loss from illness, weight gain from any number of causes, the physical exhaustion that came from a body run on too little sleep and too much social performance, all of it could be smoothed, structured and disguised beneath layers of boning and silk. A woman who was unwell, who might in a later century have simply stayed home and rested, frequently could not afford that option, because an absence from the social calendar, unexplained or explained too vaguely, generated its own rumours. Better often to lace tightly, apply a careful dusting of rice powder to disguise pallor, and appear for the required hour at the required event, however much the appearance cost her afterward. Alone, unlacing in that same low-lit dressing room, gasping the particular gasp that women of this era knew well enough to have a private, unspoken vocabulary for among themselves, though never, of course, in front of men. There is a detail here that has stayed with me since I first came across it, and I want to share it with you because I think it captures something true about the whole system. Doctors of the period, a good number of them anyway, publicly condemned tight lacing as dangerous to a woman's health, and medical journals of the 1880s and 90s are full of warnings about compressed organs, restricted breathing, weakened muscles that could never again support a woman's frame without external structure. Some of these warnings were exaggerated for effect, others were simply accurate, and yet the practice continued, not because women were unaware of the risk, but because the social risk of appearing improperly shaped, improperly composed, improperly concealed, was for many of them the greater and more immediate danger. You cannot die of a rumour. But a rumour in that world could very effectively end the only kind of life a woman of that class had been raised, trained, and permitted to live. Now, let us slow down here for a moment and talk about mourning, because I think it is one of the most quietly devastating aspects of this entire era, and it connects directly back to our woman in the dressing room in ways you will see shortly. Mourning in the 1890s still followed rules laid down decades earlier, largely under the long, extraordinary influence of Queen Victoria herself, who had worn black in mourning for her husband Albert for the remaining 4 decades of her life, a public performance of grief so total and so sustained that it shaped the etiquette of an entire English-speaking world, America very much included. A widow of proper standing was expected to observe what was called deep mourning for a period of approximately 1 year and a day, during which she wore unrelieved black, generally in dull, non-reflective fabrics like crepe, which had no shine to catch the light, because shine itself was considered an inappropriate note of vanity in a woman meant to be visibly, continuously grieving. Jewellery during this period, if worn at all, was restricted to mourning jewellery specifically, jet, a fossilized coal that took a deep black polish, or pieces incorporating the hair of the deceased, woven and worked by specialist jewelers into brooches, rings and bracelets, an object you could wear against your skin that literally contained a physical remnant of the person you had lost. After the year of deep mourning came a period called second mourning, generally another 6 months, during which small amounts of trim, a touch of white at the collar and cuffs, a slightly less severe fabric were permitted. Then half mourning, perhaps another 6 months, during which soft greys, mauves and lavenders entered a woman's wardrobe gradually, colours specifically chosen because they occupied a visual middle ground, no longer black, not yet the full palette of ordinary life. The entire progression taken together could occupy 2 full years of a widow's life, 2 years during which her clothing announced her grief to every person she passed on the street, whether she wished it announced or not. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. This system, rigid as it sounds to modern ears, was not without a certain mercy built into it, at least on the surface. It gave grief a structure, a socially sanctioned shape, a permission slip in effect, that allowed a woman to withdraw from the exhausting performance of the season for a defined and universally respected period. Invitations were not expected during deep mourning. Calls were not expected to be made or received in the usual volume. For a woman utterly exhausted by the ceaseless calculus of society, and many of them were exhausted in ways nobody around them was permitted to acknowledge, a death in the family, terrible as it was, could also function as the only socially acceptable form of rest available to her. But the system had a darker underside too, and this is where it circles back to the story we started with tonight. Mourning was legible, publicly, permanently, in a way few other states were. A widow's black dress told the entire street exactly what had happened to her and roughly when. And this meant that mourning etiquette became, for some families, another instrument of concealment and control, deployed strategically rather than simply observed out of grief. A family managing a scandal, a suicide, an overdose, a death that occurred somewhere it should not have, in circumstances that would not survive close examination, could sometimes use the rituals and the seclusion of official mourning to buy time, to keep a household out of society's sightline during precisely the period when the truth might otherwise have come out, letting the passage of the mourning calendar itself do the work of quietly, gradually, replacing scandal with simple, unquestioned grief in the public memory. I find myself circling back to that detail I mentioned earlier, the one about the calling card left with a corner turned down for condolence. Even death, even the rawest and most private of all human experiences, had been folded into the silent, coded language that governed every other part of these women's lives. Grief itself required the correct card, the correct fabric, the correct interval of silence before letters could resume in their ordinary tone. There was, in the end, almost no corner of a woman's life in this world that had not been given its etiquette, its correct performance, its watching audience. Let us return for a moment to the woman in the dressing room, because I think it is time you knew her a little better, and I think too that you will recognize something of yourself in her, whether or not you have ever laced a corset or left a calling card in your life. Let us call her Adelaide, because a story needs a name to hold on to, even a story built, as this one is, from many women's real lives folded together into one composite figure. Adelaide is 34. Her husband, whom we will call Charles, made a fortune in railroad securities that has grown over the past decade, from comfortable to genuinely enormous. And it is precisely that recentness, that speed, that makes Adelaide's position in society more precarious than it might appear from the outside. She was raised, in fact, in a family with more name than money, an old, faded, entirely respectable lineage that had, by the time she was of marriageable age, very little actual capital left to sustain it. Her marriage to Charles was, in the blunt and unromantic language the newspapers of the time actually used for such arrangements, a dollar princess situation in reverse, though the term is usually reserved for American heiresses marrying impoverished European titles. Adelaide brought the name, Charles brought the money. Between them they had assembled something that looked, from a sufficient distance, like the genuine article. This matters enormously to our story tonight, because it means Adelaide understands, with a precision that a woman born into truly old, truly secure money never has to develop, exactly how fragile the whole performance is. She did not inherit her social position. She built it, deliberately, call by call, dinner by dinner, over 12 years of unrelenting attention to 1,000 small details that most of the women around her born to this life never had to consciously think about at all. And that is precisely why the 11 weeks she has told no one about frighten her as much as they do. It is not simply the pregnancy itself, it is the timing, and what the timing might suggest to women who have spent 12 years watching her, some of them warmly, most of them with the particular narrow-eyed attentiveness that this world trained into its members from girlhood. I want to tell you about correspondence now, because it is, I think, one of the least understood aspects of this entire world, and it explains a great deal about what Adelaide will do in the weeks ahead. A woman of Adelaide's standing wrote, on an ordinary week during the social season, an extraordinary volume of letters, Invitations accepted and declined, each requiring its own carefully worded response within a socially prescribed window, typically no more than a day or two, because a slow reply communicated, as clearly as a slow returned calling card, a lack of proper regard. Condolence letters, congratulatory letters on engagements, births, promotions and honours, letters to her dressmaker specifying alterations, letters to her husband's mother, a formidable woman named, let us say, Mrs. Winthrop, who expected a letter at least twice weekly regardless of whether there was any actual news to report, because the letter itself, its punctuality and its tone was the point, far more than its content. And letters, too, to her small, carefully chosen circle of genuinely close friends, women she had known since girlhood or had come to trust across years of careful mutual observation, letters in which, occasionally, cautiously, something closer to her actual thoughts might appear, the etiquette manuals of the period, and there were dozens of them in circulation, some running to 400 and 500 pages, devoted extraordinary attention to the physical mechanics of correspondence. The correct stationery, heavy cream or pale grey, never coloured, monogrammed but never garishly so. The correct ink, black, never blue, which was considered faintly common. The correct manner of folding a letter, of sealing it, of addressing the envelope in a hand that had been trained since childhood to a specific, recognisable elegance, because a woman's handwriting was itself a form of public presentation, studied and judged the way a modern eye might study someone's handwriting on a wedding invitation, and draw quiet conclusions about the family that sent it. But here is the detail that I think reveals the true stakes of all this correspondence, the detail that connects directly to what Adelaide is doing tonight, in the hour after her maid finally leaves her alone. Letters in this world were dangerous objects. They were evidence in the most literal sense, written, dated, often signed, capable of surviving their author by decades if not properly destroyed. A single indiscreet letter, a single sentence written in a moment of genuine feeling rather than careful composure, could end a marriage, end a friendship, end a reputation, if it fell into the wrong hands or was produced at the wrong moment by the wrong person. Divorce proceedings of the era, rare as they were among society's upper tier, frequently turned on exactly this kind of evidence. Letters read aloud in courtrooms, published sometimes in newspapers that had learnt exactly how much circulation a society scandal could generate, which is why, in households across Fifth Avenue and out along the Newport shoreline, women burned their letters, not occasionally, not only in moments of crisis, but as a matter of ordinary, almost ritual household practice. A fire kept lit in a private sitting room specifically for this purpose. Correspondence read, absorbed, and then committed to the flames before it could accumulate into a paper trail that someone, someday, might read who was never meant to. Adelaide burns 3 letters that night, after Ellis has gone, after the house has gone properly quiet. One from her physician, whom she visited under a name that was not quite her own, at an address chosen specifically because it was unlikely to be recognized by anyone in her circle. One from her closest friend, a woman we will meet properly a little later tonight, containing advice too plainly written to risk anyone else ever laying eyes on it. And one, the oldest of the 3, from years earlier that she has kept, foolishly perhaps, far longer than she should have, and that she finally, on this particular night, decides it is time to let go of completely. I find something genuinely moving in that detail. The small private fire, the woman alone with it at 1 in the morning, feeding paper into flame one careful sheet at a time, watching each word disappear before the next goes in. It is not glamorous. It would never appear in a painting. But it is, I think, one of the truest images this entire era has to offer. Truer by far than any ballroom, because it shows you exactly what the appearance of effortless perfection actually cost, and who was left alone to pay that cost, night after night in rooms nobody else ever saw. Now let me tell you about debt, because this is where the concealment stops being personal and starts being structural. woven into the very architecture of how these households were run. It is one of the great quiet ironies of the Gilded Age that many of its most visibly wealthy families were, at various points, dancing along the edge of financial catastrophe, and that the appearance of limitless wealth was itself one of the most carefully maintained fictions of the entire era. Fortunes made quickly on railroads, on speculative securities, on real estate ventures that depended on markets which could and sometimes did collapse without warning, were nowhere near as stable as the marble facades built to represent them. A man like Charles might be on any given month enormously wealthy on paper and genuinely strained for actual liquid cash, his fortune tied up in stock that could not be sold without signaling weakness to every competitor watching the market, his household expenses running at a level that assumed permanence his actual financial position did not always guarantee, and it was, overwhelmingly, the women of these households who managed the daily arithmetic of that gap, because a man's business affairs were understood to be entirely his domain, but the household budget, the day-to-day expenditure that kept the appearance of the family running smoothly, fell to his wife, and fell to her specifically because it was considered beneath a gentleman's attention and beneath a lady's dignity to discuss openly, which meant it had to be managed silently, invisibly, through 1,000 small decisions that never appeared in any account book anyone outside the family would ever see. Adelaide keeps in a locked drawer of her writing desk a small ledger that Charles has never seen and does not know exists. In it, she tracks which merchants can be paid promptly and which can be, with careful diplomatic delay, allowed to wait another season without provoking the kind of quiet talk among tradesmen that eventually inevitably reaches other households. She knows which dressmaker's bill can be settled a month late without comment, because the dressmaker depends on her patronage too much to risk the relationship over a delay, and which butcher's account must never, under any circumstances, run more than 2 weeks behind, because tradesmen of that class talk to one another, and a rumour that a Fifth Avenue household is slow to pay its butcher travels through the service entrances of a dozen other mansions faster than any letter ever could. She decides, silently and without consulting Charles, that the ball they are meant to host in April will use last year's floral arrangements refreshed rather than an entirely new commission, a saving of several $100s that no guest will ever notice, because Adelaide has spent a decade learning exactly which extravagances register in a guest's memory and which do not. She decides that a planned renovation of the second-floor guest rooms will be delayed another year, framed to the household staff and to any curious visitor as a matter of taste and timing rather than necessity. She decides this is the detail that stops people cold every time I tell it, which of her own jewellery can be quietly sold through a discreet dealer who understands the importance of discretion and charges accordingly for it, and replaced with a skillfully made paste copy that will pass inspection under gaslight from anyone who is not looking specifically for a flaw, freeing capital that Charles believes is simply sitting, untouched, in her jewellery case exactly where it has always been. This is not deception in the sense we might casually use that word today, or rather it is deception technically, but it is deception performed as a form of care, as the only tool available to a woman who understood, better than her husband often did, exactly how thin the margin was between the household's visible prosperity and a genuinely damaging reversal. Adelaide is, in the fullest sense, managing a business with a staff of 11, an annual budget that would have supported several working-class families for a decade, and a set of stakeholders, her husband, her children, her own mother, her husband's formidable mother, none of whom she is permitted to discuss the actual figures with honestly. She does this work alone, every week for years, and no accounting exists anywhere that records what she has saved, prevented, or quietly averted, because the entire point of the work is that it must never be visible enough to require acknowledgement. Let me tell you now about scandal and how it was actually managed, because the popular imagination tends to picture Gilded Age scandal as something loud, public, resolved in newspaper headlines and courtroom dramas. Sometimes it was, But far more often, the real work of managing a scandal happened exactly the way Adelaide burns her letters, quietly, privately, in rooms with the door closed, by women who had spent their entire lives learning how to make a problem simply stop existing in polite conversation. Consider the mechanics of it, because I think the mechanics are more interesting than the scandals themselves. A young woman of good family, unmarried, found herself in what the euphemisms of the period called delicate circumstances. This happened more often than the social fiction of the era liked to acknowledge, and when it did, the family's response followed a pattern so well established that entire informal networks existed to facilitate it. The young woman would be sent, with very little advance notice to the wider circle of family friends, to visit a distant relative, often one conveniently located in Europe, or in a quieter American city where the family's social standing did not travel with quite the same intensity. She would remain there for a period of months, sometimes closer to a year, and would return eventually composed, unremarked upon. The entire episode folded quietly into the enormous category of things that women of that world understood not to ask about directly. I want to be careful here because I do not want to make this sound simple or without cost, because it was neither. The young woman at the centre of one of these arrangements paid an enormous price, in isolation, in grief, in the particular loneliness of being sent away from everyone she knew at exactly the moment she most needed the people who loved her. Some of these arrangements ended, quietly, in adoption, the child placed with a family who never knew or never acknowledged the child's true origins. Some ended differently, in ways the records of the period, deliberately incomplete as they often are, do not always make clear, and I do not think it serves you well at this hour for me to speculate further than the evidence actually allows. What I can tell you with confidence is that this machinery of quiet removal and quiet return existed, was well understood among women of a certain class, and depended entirely on the discretion of everyone involved, from the family itself down to the servants who packed the trunks and never spoke of where the young lady had actually gone. And here, I think, is where we start to see something genuinely important about the relationships between women in this world, something that complicates the picture of them as simply rivals competing for the same limited social oxygen, which is part of the truth but not the whole of it, because managing a scandal like this required accomplices. It required a mother's sister willing to host a young woman for months without explanation and without complaint. It required friends willing to answer casual questions at dinner parties with a vague, unbothered confidence that discouraged further inquiry, women who had, in effect, agreed among themselves, without ever quite saying so aloud, to close ranks around a story and hold it closed. It required, very often, a doctor willing to write whatever diagnosis was needed for the public record, a nervous complaint, a delicate constitution requiring rest and change of air, language flexible enough to cover almost anything without technically stating a falsehood that could later be proven. This is, I think, one of the more remarkable and least appreciated aspects of women's social lives in this era. Alongside the fierce, genuine competition for social standing, alongside the careful hierarchy of the social register and the calling cards and Mrs. Astor's 400, there existed a second, quieter system entirely, a system of mutual protection, built not on affection necessarily, though sometimes it was that too, but on a shared and absolute understanding that the same fate could befall any of them, that the woman helping to cover for her friend's daughter today might very well need the same discretion returned to her tomorrow, for a scandal of her own, or her own daughter's, or her own sister's. I think of it almost like an insurance system, invisible, unwritten, entirely dependent on trust that could never be formally guaranteed, and yet somehow, remarkably, it mostly held. Women who had spent years competing viciously over the placement of a dinner table seating chart, over whose ball received more coverage in the society pages, over whose daughter made the more advantageous match, would set that competition aside instantly and completely the moment a genuine crisis required it. Because the alternative, a world in which women turn scandal against one another for social advantage rather than closing ranks against it, would have been so dangerous, so mutually destructive, that nobody could actually afford to let it happen. The same secrecy that isolated a woman like Adelaide in her dressing room at 1 in the morning also, in its way, protected her, because the entire system depended on everyone understanding that today's silence purchased tomorrow's, that the woman who kept your secret this season would need hers kept the next. There is a particular kind of conversation that happened between women in this world, and I want to try to describe it to you because it will not sound like the conversations you are used to, and understanding the shape of it tells you something true about how tightly controlled even friendship had become. Two women, close friends, women who had known each other since their own girlhood seasons, might sit together over tea in a private morning room, entirely alone, servants dismissed, and still speak in a kind of code, a language of implication and careful phrasing that let each of them understand exactly what the other meant, without either of them ever saying the plain, dangerous version of it aloud. Adelaide's closest friend, whom we will call Margaret, a woman she has trusted since they were girls together at a school in Connecticut, comes to visit 2 days after the ball, ostensibly to discuss nothing more significant than a charity committee they both sit on, the Ladies' Auxiliary, for a hospital that several of the city's wealthiest families supported as a matter of visible, respectable philanthropy. They discuss the committee for perhaps 10 minutes, the correct amount of time to satisfy the servant who brings the tea tray and might, in the ordinary course of household gossip below stairs, mention what the ladies discussed. And then Margaret sets down her cup and says, in a tone that would sound to any outside listener like the most ordinary small talk imaginable, that she has heard the spring air in the countryside has been particularly good this year, restorative, the kind of air a woman feeling unusually tired might benefit from, perhaps even for an extended stay. Adelaide understands, instantly and completely, exactly what is being offered. Margaret has a small property inherited from an aunt in a quiet part of the Hudson Valley, rarely used, rarely mentioned, precisely the kind of place where a woman might disappear for a period of months under the entirely respectable cover story of needing rest and change of air, and reappear later having apparently recovered fully, the whole episode requiring no explanation because none had technically been given in the first place. Adelaide has not told Margaret about the 11 weeks. She has not needed to. Margaret, watching her closely at the ball 2 nights earlier, watching the particular careful way Adelaide moved through the receiving line, the slight paleness beneath the rice powder that a lifelong friend's eye catches even when a stranger's would not, has simply understood the way women of this world had trained themselves across a lifetime to understand, without requiring confirmation, without requiring the danger of the actual words. This, I think, is the detail that I find most quietly remarkable about the whole system, and I want to give it room to sit with you for a moment rather than rushing past it. These women built, out of necessity, an entire language for saying important, dangerous, deeply personal things without ever technically saying them. A language precise enough to convey real information and vague enough to survive being overheard by a servant, repeated at another dinner table, or, worst of all, produced later as evidence in a moment of genuine crisis. It is in its strange way a kind of intimacy, this code, built between women who trusted each other enough to risk speaking it, even indirectly, even in careful fragments over a tea tray in a private morning room with the door not quite fully closed. Adelaide does not accept Margaret's offer outright, not that morning. She thanks her for the thought in the same careful coded register and says she will consider it, and both women understand this is not indecision but simply the correct pace for a conversation this delicate, a pace that cannot be rushed without drawing attention to exactly how much is actually being decided. But something in her shoulders, Margaret notices, eases very slightly, the smallest fraction of relief, because now at least she is not entirely alone with it. Now there is one other person in the world who knows, or knows enough, and who has already, without being asked directly, begun quietly arranging the machinery that might carry her through the months ahead. I want to pause here and say something honest, because I think it matters, and because I think it is easy, telling this story from over a century's distance, to make it sound almost elegant, This whole system of coded tea conversations and quiet countryside retreats, it was not elegant for the woman living inside it. It was exhausting in a way that is difficult to fully convey unless you have spent time imagining what it costs a person to never, not once, in any conversation, with any friend in any room, say plainly and simply what is actually happening to her. Adelaide has been carrying this alone for 11 weeks. She will likely carry versions of it in different forms for the rest of her life, because this was not a single crisis she would eventually move past into some easier, more honest existence. It was the ordinary condition of being a woman in this world, one crisis giving way to the next, each one requiring its own careful management, its own tightened lacing, its own burned letter, its own coded conversation over tea. For years, for decades, for the entire span of what society called, without any apparent sense of irony, a fortunate life. Let me tell you a little more about reputation itself, because I think it is worth understanding precisely how fragile it actually was, and how little truth had to do with its destruction, because that detail, more than almost any other, explains the constant, low-grade vigilance that shaped every hour of a woman's day in this world. A reputation, in the strict, almost legal sense that society understood the word, was not built primarily on what a woman actually did. It was built on what could be plausibly said about her, and repeated, and believed, regardless of whether any of it was true. This is a distinction I think is genuinely important, and one that modern retellings of the era sometimes lose. A woman could live a life of complete, boring, verifiable propriety and still find herself ruined by a rumor that had no basis in fact whatsoever, simply because the rumor was interesting enough and delivered by a source credible enough to take hold in the collective imagination of the drawing rooms that mattered. Consider how a rumor actually traveled in this world, because the mechanism is almost elegant in its efficiency and almost entirely outside any individual woman's control. It rarely began with an outright accusation. It began more often with an observation, offered casually, apparently without malice. Someone might mention at a dinner party that a certain lady had seemed unusually flushed at the opera the previous week, or that her carriage had been seen on a particular street at an hour when it had no obvious business being there, or that she had declined an invitation citing illness and then had been glimpsed, apparently in perfectly good health, at a milliner's shop 2 days later. None of these observations individually constituted an accusation of anything, but strung together, repeated across enough dinner tables, embellished slightly with each retelling in the way that all gossip inevitably is embellished, they accumulated into something that functioned, for all practical social purposes, exactly like proof, even though no single piece of it would have survived serious scrutiny. And here is the part that I think is genuinely chilling when you sit with it properly. There was almost no effective mechanism by which a woman could defend herself against a rumor of this kind, to address it directly, to stand up at a dinner party and deny a specific piece of gossip, was itself considered a kind of social error, because it confirmed that the rumor existed, that it had reached her, that it mattered enough to warrant a response. The correct strategy, the only strategy that etiquette actually sanctioned, was silence, continued composure, an unbothered appearance at exactly the events where the rumor was most actively circulating, trusting that time and the appearance of untroubled confidence would eventually starve the story of its energy. This worked sometimes, it did not work other times, and a woman whose reputation had been damaged badly enough could find herself, within a single season, quietly excluded from the guest lists that mattered, her invitations thinning, her calling cards returned more slowly, her daughter's marriage prospects narrowing in ways nobody would ever explain to her directly, because explaining it directly would have required someone to say the actual accusation aloud, and nobody ever wanted to be the one who said it aloud. I think this is in some ways the cruelest mechanism in the entire system, crueler even than the concealment Adelaide practices in her dressing room, because at least concealment gives a woman some agency, some control over her own story. A rumor gives her almost none. She can lace her corset as tightly as she likes, burn every letter, manage every debt with flawless discretion, and still find herself destroyed by a story that began with nothing more than an idle comment about a flushed complexion at the opera, a story she may never even fully learn the contents of, because nobody in this world ever told a woman directly what was being said about her. She simply felt the temperature of the rooms around her change gradually, unmistakably, and had to work out for herself what exactly she had supposedly done. Let me give you a specific composite example, built from the pattern of several real cases documented in the letters and diaries that survive from this period, because I think a specific story will land with more weight than the general description alone. A young married woman, we will call her Louisa, attended a house party at a Newport cottage one summer and was seated, purely as a matter of table arrangement decided by her hostess and having nothing whatsoever to do with her own preference, next to a gentleman who was not her husband for 2 consecutive dinners. Nothing occurred beyond ordinary dinner conversation, but another guest, a woman with her own reasons, perhaps jealousy, perhaps simple boredom, perhaps genuine malice nobody ever fully understood, mentioned afterward, in the kind of studiously neutral tone that made the observation sound almost like an innocent aside, that Louisa and the gentleman in question had seemed remarkably comfortable together, remarkably easy in conversation, for 2 people who had, as far as anyone knew, met for the first time that weekend. That single sentence, repeated across perhaps a dozen drawing rooms over the following month, each retelling adding a small embellishment, a knowing pause, a raised eyebrow that the original speaker had never actually made, became by autumn a fully formed story of an affair that had never happened, an affair with no evidence beyond a seating chart and one woman's idle remark. Louisa's husband heard a version of it eventually, filtered through several retellings by the time it reached him, and though he did not believe it, not really, the mere fact that he had heard it at all, that it had travelled far enough and persistently enough to reach his ears through his own social circle, created a strain in the marriage that took years to fully dissolve, if it ever fully did. Louisa herself never learned who had started it, never learned the exact wording of what had actually been said, and spent the following 2 social seasons rebuilding a reputation for a transgression she had never committed, through the same painstaking, exhausting work of composure and careful appearance that women like Adelaide practiced every single day, regardless of whether they had anything at all to hide. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the unfairness of it, the sheer arbitrary cruelty of a system in which a seating chart could end a marriage's ease and a woman's peace of mind for years, through no fault of her own, simply because the machinery of gossip needed almost nothing to begin turning. This, I think, is the deepest and most quietly devastating truth about the constant vigilance we have been describing all evening. Women in this world were not performing composure because they necessarily had something to hide. Many of them, most of them, on any given day, had done nothing wrong at all. They performed composure because the absence of something to hide offered almost no protection whatsoever against a story that could be manufactured from nothing more than a flushed complexion, a seating arrangement, or a moment's idle comment over dinner. I want to spend some time now on the etiquette manuals themselves, because I think they reveal something the historians sometimes miss when they focus only on the grand events, the balls and the weddings and the opera nights. The manuals were where the real education happened, and the real education began far earlier than most people realize, often in girlhood, well before a young woman had any concept of what the rules were actually protecting her from, or protecting other people from her. Books like Manners and Social Usages, written by Mrs. John Sherwood and widely read across exactly this period, or the various etiquette guides published under names like Mrs. Burton Kingsland, ran to hundreds of pages covering, in extraordinary and sometimes almost comic detail, the correct behaviour for every conceivable social situation a woman of standing might encounter, the correct way to enter a room, the correct way to acknowledge an acquaintance on the street, which depended entirely on whether that acquaintance had been formally introduced, and whether the introduction had been made by someone of sufficiently equal standing to both parties, because an improper introduction could taint an entire subsequent acquaintance in ways that took years to fully understand and correct. The correct interval of time to wait before returning a call, the correct number of minutes to remain at a formal call, generally somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, no longer, because remaining too long suggested either a lack of other social obligations, which was itself faintly embarrassing, or an over-familiarity that had not actually been earned. I find something almost tender in how seriously young women were made to study this material, and something quietly heartbreaking in it too, because the manuals presented themselves always as guides to graciousness, to putting others at ease, to the small kindnesses that made social life pleasant for everyone involved. And there is truth in that framing. Good manners, executed well, genuinely did smooth the friction of daily life among people who saw each other constantly, who depended on each other's goodwill for the ordinary comforts of their existence. But underneath the language of graciousness sat something harder and less generous, a system of near-constant evaluation in which every gesture, correctly or incorrectly performed, contributed to a running tally of a woman's fitness for the world she had been born or married into, a tally she could never see directly, never appeal, and never stop contributing to, because even the choice not to participate, to skip a call, to send a card rather than appear in person, was itself a data point, read and interpreted by everyone around her. A girl of 12 or 13, in a household like the one Adelaide grew up in, would already have begun this education in earnest, practicing the correct depth of curtsy for various social ranks, memorizing the order of precedence that determined who entered a dining room first at a formal dinner, a question that sounds almost absurd stated plainly but that governed real anxiety at real dinner tables, because an error in precedence, seating a guest incorrectly relative to her actual social rank, was an insult that guest would notice immediately and remember for years. By the time a young woman made her formal debut into society, usually somewhere between 17 and 19, she had absorbed thousands of individual rules so thoroughly that the correct performance of them had become, in a very real sense, instinctive, no more consciously effortful than breathing, which was, of course, precisely the point. The system worked best, was most convincing, when it no longer looked like a system at all, when it simply looked like who a woman naturally, effortlessly was. I want to talk now about the lady's maid relationship again, because I promised you earlier we would return to it, and because I think it is one of the truest, most complicated, and most under-examined relationships of the entire era. Adelaide's maid, whom we will call Ellen, has been with her for 6 years, hired shortly after Adelaide's marriage to Charles, and trained, largely by Adelaide herself in those early years, in the specific preferences, rhythms, and requirements of this particular household. The relationship between a lady and her maid occupied a strange and genuinely unique space in the social architecture of the period, closer and more constant than almost any other relationship in a woman's life, including in certain respects her marriage, and yet governed by a class divide so absolute that the two women would never have considered themselves equals, never have socialized outside the household, never have addressed each other by anything other than the formal names their respective positions required. And yet, Ellen dresses Adelaide's body every single day, sees her in states of undress that no one else in the household, including Charles, regularly witnesses. Ellen laces the corset that hides the 11 weeks. Ellen has, by this point in their 6 years together, almost surely noticed things about Adelaide's private life, her private grief, her private exhaustion, that Adelaide has never spoken aloud to another living soul. This is not incidental to the job. It is in a very real sense the actual content of the job, far more than the technical skills of hairdressing and dress-fitting that a maid's formal duties describe. A truly excellent lady's maid, and Ellen is one, functions as a kind of silent witness to her mistress's entire interior life, present for the moments of genuine collapse that happen behind closed doors, present for the tears that a woman of Adelaide's position could never permit herself in front of her husband, her mother, or any of the friends whose good opinion she depends on. What did Ellen actually know that night, as she worked the laces a half-inch tighter than usual and said nothing at all? I think, honestly, that she knew everything, or nearly everything, the way a maid who has dressed the same body for 6 years simply knows things without requiring them to be explained. She would have known the particular quality of exhaustion in Adelaide's face that week, distinct from the ordinary exhaustion of the social season. She would have noticed, because noticing was quite literally her job, the days Adelaide declined breakfast, the mornings she asked for the curtains kept slightly more closed than usual against a light that had begun, for reasons neither of them discussed, to bother her more than it once had. And Ellen said nothing, because saying something was never, under any circumstances, part of the arrangement between them. This silence should not be mistaken for coldness, or for a lack of genuine feeling between the two women, because the historical record, in the surviving letters and occasional diary entries of ladies' maids from this period, some of which were later collected and published, suggests something considerably warmer and more complicated than simple professional distance. Many ladies' maids describe a real, if carefully bounded, affection for the women they served, a pride in their skill, a genuine investment in their mistress's well-being that went beyond what mere employment required. But the silence, the discretion, was itself a form of that care, perhaps the deepest form available within the rigid boundaries of the relationship. Ellen's silence protected Adelaide as thoroughly as any burned letter or coded conversation over tea, because a maid who gossiped below stairs about what she observed in her mistress's dressing room would not remain employed for long in any respectable household, and every maid understood this, understood that her own livelihood depended, in a very real and practical sense, on becoming the kind of woman who saw everything and repeated nothing. I think there is something worth pausing on here, something about the particular loneliness of being genuinely known by someone you can never actually speak with as an equal. Adelaide trusts Ellen more completely, in certain narrow but real respects, than she trusts almost anyone else in her life, and yet the two women will never sit together as friends, will never discuss what they both know plainly to be true, will maintain, across the entire span of their working relationship, the careful formal distance that both of their positions require. This is its own kind of isolation, layered on top of all the others we have discussed tonight, the isolation of being witnessed completely by someone you can never fully acknowledge witnessing you. Let me take you to Newport for a while, because I think the summer season there reveals something about this world that the winter months in the city do not, and because I want to slow down now and let the details settle a little more gently than we have been moving so far. By the 1890s, Newport, Rhode Island had become, for roughly 6 or 8 weeks each summer, the most concentrated gathering of American wealth anywhere on the continent. The families who spent their winters in the formal, columned mansions of Fifth Avenue relocated, almost entirely, to a stretch of coastline along Bellevue Avenue and out toward Oka Point, where they had built what they insisted, with a straight face that has become one of the era's great small jokes, on calling cottages structures of 1790. In the case of the Vanderbilt's breakers, well over 100 rooms, faced in limestone and marble, positioned to catch the Atlantic light and the Atlantic wind in equal, carefully calculated measure. The rhythm of a Newport day moved differently than the rhythm of the city season, and I think this matters because it changed subtly the texture of the concealment we have been discussing all evening. Mornings were quieter, given over to correspondence and to what was called, without much precision, taking the air, a walk or a carriage ride along the famous cliff walk. The ocean on one side, the lawns and hedges of the great estates on the other, both sides equally worth being seen upon. Afternoons brought calls, much as in the city, though conducted at a slightly less frantic pace, the summer heat itself discouraging the kind of relentless, overlapping schedule that governed a woman's winter days. And evenings were where Newport truly showed itself. Dinners that began at 8 and could run past midnight, followed by dancing, followed, for the women who had survived the whole performance without visible fatigue, by the long carriage ride home along dark coastal roads with the sound of the surf somewhere below, and the smell of salt and cut grass coming through the open window. I want to give you a specific evening because I think the specificity will help you feel it rather than simply understand it. It is a Thursday in August, and Adelaide and Charles are dining at a cottage belonging to a family we will call the Vandermeers, one of the truly old, truly secure names in this world. The kind of invitation that still, after 12 years, sends a small current of something like relief through Adelaide's chest when it arrives, because it confirms yet again that the position she has built has held. The dinner itself runs to 11 courses, a length that sounds almost absurd from a modern vantage point, but that was, by the standards of a formal Newport dinner in this period, entirely unremarkable. Consommé to begin, followed by a fish course, terrapin prepared in the rich, sherry-laced style that Maryland and Chesapeake terrapin commanded on the finest tables of the era, a delicacy so fashionable and so expensive that its over-harvesting during exactly this period would eventually drive the species towards serious decline, though nobody at the Vandermeer table that evening gave that fact a single thought. Then a saddle of mutton, then a sorbet served between courses specifically to cleanse the palate and allow the meal to continue at its considerable length, then game birds, then salad, then a savoury, then dessert, then fruit and nuts and coffee, the entire sequence stretched across 2 full hours, each course paired with its own wine, poured and cleared by a staff of footmen whose choreography had been rehearsed to a precision that made the whole enormous production appear, to any observer not looking too closely, effortless. Adelaide sits, for this particular dinner, between an elderly gentleman with considerable railroad interests and a younger man she does not know well, and she performs, across those 2 hours, the particular skill that the etiquette manuals called being agreeable, which meant, in practice, drawing out a dinner companion's preferred topics of conversation, listening with apparent genuine interest to opinions she may or may not actually share, steering conversation gently away from anything that might prove awkward or contentious, and doing all of this while eating an 11-course meal at a pace slow enough to appear unhurried and light enough to leave room for the corset's demands, a balance that took years to learn and that she now performs, on the surface at least, without any visible effort whatsoever. Beneath the surface, though, on this particular Thursday, something else is happening, something we have already met. Adelaide is 19 weeks along now, further than the corset alone can fully manage, and the dress she is wearing tonight, a deep sea green silk with a modest but carefully constructed drape at the front, has been altered by Ellen over the past several weeks with the kind of quiet skill that leaves no trace of alteration visible to anyone who does not already know precisely what to look for. She has told Charles now. That happened 6 weeks ago on his return from a business trip, in a conversation that went, in the end, better than she had feared through so many sleepless nights of calculation, because Charles, whatever else might be said of him, loves her in the somewhat formal, somewhat distant way that men of his class and generation had generally been raised to love their wives, and the arithmetic of the calendar, once she explained it to him plainly, troubled him rather less than she had expected, because a child arriving considerably ahead of a strictly proper schedule was, as it turned out, a survivable embarrassment for a man, in a way it was never quite a survivable embarrassment for a woman, a discrepancy Adelaide has had a great deal of time to sit with and resent, quietly, in the privacy of her own thoughts, without ever once saying so aloud to anyone, including Charles. What remains unresolved, what still occupies the careful architecture of concealment we have spent this evening exploring, is the public timeline, the calendar that society at large will eventually reconstruct, the arithmetic that women like the one who started the rumor about Louisa in an earlier chapter of tonight's story are entirely capable of performing with terrifying speed and terrifying confidence. Adelaide and Charles have decided together on a story, one that will place the wedding date and the child's eventual birth date at a distance just barely sufficient to avoid the sharpest edge of comment, a story that depends on nobody looking too closely at the actual arithmetic, which is, of course, precisely the arithmetic that certain women in this world make their particular specialty. The dinner ends. The gentlemen retire briefly to a smoking room for cigars and brandy, a segregation of the sexes so complete and so universal in this world that it barely requires comment, though I think it is worth naming anyway, because it meant that women, for a portion of every formal evening, were left entirely to their own company in a drawing room, with coffee and conversation that moved, once the men had gone, into a slightly different register, slightly franker, slightly less performed, though never, even then, entirely honest. It is in this drawing room, in the 20 minutes or so before the gentlemen rejoin them, that Adelaide sits beside Margaret, who has also been invited tonight, and the two women speak in low voices about nothing in particular, and everything that matters, while around them the other women of the party discuss dressmakers and children, and a forthcoming wedding with the same unhurried, apparently effortless grace that governs every visible surface of this world. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the Atlantic moves against the rocks below the cliff walk, steady, indifferent, entirely unconcerned with the arithmetic of any human calendar, and somewhere above the water the first stars have come out, the way they do every August night, whether anyone in a drawing room happens to notice them or not. I want to talk now about the marriage market itself, because I think it explains a great deal about why women guarded their reputations with the fierce, constant vigilance we have been describing, and because it will help you understand what Adelaide's own mother was actually doing all those years ago when she raised her daughter inside this system in the first place. A daughter's marriage, in this world, was not a private matter between two young people who happened to fall in love. It was, in the most literal and unsentimental sense, a transaction, one of the most significant financial and social transactions a family would ever undertake, and it was managed, almost entirely, by mothers who studied the field of eligible young men with the same rigor a modern investor might apply to a portfolio of stocks. A daughter's own preferences mattered, without question, more by the 1890s than they had a generation or two earlier, as the era's ideas about companionate marriage slowly, unevenly began to soften the harder edges of purely arranged matches. But preference operated within extremely narrow bounds, a field of acceptable candidates already filtered, before a daughter ever met them at a ball or a dinner, by considerations of fortune, family, religion, and standing that she herself had almost no say in establishing. The debutante season existed specifically to facilitate this sorting process, and I think it is worth walking through what it actually involved, because the popular image, a young woman in white presented to society at a single glamorous ball, captures only the ceremonial surface of what was, underneath, a sustained, months-long campaign. A young woman's formal debut typically occurred sometime in her late teens, and from that first appearance forward, her mother, and often a small committee of aunts and family friends operating in close coordination, managed an extraordinarily deliberate calendar of exposure. Which balls she attended and in what order, which teas and luncheons placed her in proximity to which families, which young men were quietly encouraged toward an introduction, and which were, with equal quietness, steered away, sometimes for reasons the daughter herself was never told. A fortune that looked larger than it actually was, a family with a scandal in its recent past that had not yet been fully forgotten, a temperament that a watchful mother judged, correctly or not, unsuited to her daughter's particular disposition. Real stakes rode on this campaign, and they fell disproportionately, almost entirely, on the daughter herself, in ways that a modern reader might find difficult to fully absorb. A woman who did not marry well, or who did not marry at all, within a socially acceptable window, generally understood to close somewhere in her mid to late 20s, though the exact edges shifted with individual circumstance, faced a diminishment of standing that touched every remaining year of her life. An unmarried woman past a certain age occupied a genuinely uncomfortable position in this social architecture, dependent in most cases on the household of a father or brother, present at social events in a diminished, faintly pitied capacity, her opinions and preferences carrying less weight in family decisions than they had when she still represented, in the cold arithmetic of the marriage market, a potential asset rather than what society regarded, with a bluntness that still stings across the distance of more than a century as a settled and disappointing outcome. Adelaide remembers her own debut season with a clarity that surprises her sometimes, even now, 12 years and 2 children and 1 carefully concealed pregnancy later. She remembers her mother's face across a crowded ballroom, tracking with an intensity that never fully relaxed across the entire evening, which young men asked Adelaide to dance, and in what order, which ones lingered afterward for conversation, which ones sought a second dance later in the evening, a request that carried its own weight of meaning in the silent grammar of the ballroom, not unlike the folded corner of a calling card. She remembers too a specific evening, her second season, when a young man she had genuinely liked, genuinely enjoyed talking with, in a way that felt, at 17, dangerously close to what she imagined love might actually feel like, was quietly, firmly redirected away from her by her mother's intervention. A conversation conducted entirely between the 2 mothers, never involving Adelaide directly, because the young man's family, it turned out, carried a debt obligation significant enough that Adelaide's mother judged the match, on purely practical grounds, unwise. She did not learn the reason for years. At 17, she simply understood that the young man stopped calling, stopped appearing at the same events, and she absorbed the loss the way girls of her position were trained to absorb every disappointment this world handed them, quietly, without visible complaint, because visible complaint about a matter as significant as a marriage prospect would itself have constituted a kind of impropriety, a suggestion that she had allowed her own feelings to matter more than her family's careful strategic considerations. I think this detail matters enormously to understanding Adelaide as an adult woman, the woman we met earlier tonight in her dressing room, lacing her corset a half-inch tighter to buy herself time. Because the entire architecture of concealment we have spent this evening exploring, the burned letters, the coded conversations, the carefully managed household ledger, the tightened lacing, all of it was built by a woman who had learned from her earliest adolescence that her own genuine feelings, her own actual preferences, were secondary at best to the practical demands of maintaining and advancing her family's position in a world that offered almost no forgiveness for missteps. She married Charles in the end, not against her own inclination exactly. She liked him well enough, respected him, came over the years to feel something she would have called love, though perhaps a quieter, more practical variety than the feeling she remembered from that brief, redirected romance at 17. But she married him also, unmistakably, because the match answered her family's needs, her name for his money, in the blunt calculation that governed almost every union of consequence in this world. And she has spent the 12 years since learning, thoroughly and completely, how to be the kind of wife that transaction required. There is something in that worth noticing, I think, something that connects directly back to the 11 weeks she carried alone in that dressing room. A woman raised inside a system that treated her own feelings as secondary to strategic necessity from the age of 17 would, almost inevitably, grow into a woman who instinctively concealed her own vulnerability, who reached without even fully deciding to for the tighter lacing and the burned letter rather than for open confession, because open confession had never in her entire lived experience been modelled to her as a safe or sanctioned option. The concealment was not simply a response to this particular crisis, it was the deepest, most thoroughly trained instinct of her entire adult life, the water she had swum in since girlhood, so familiar she could no longer fully perceive it as a choice at all. I want to talk now about exhaustion, because I do not think we have used that word enough tonight, and because I think it deserves to be named directly for a moment before we move further into the story. The women of this world were tired in a way that the surviving photographs and portraits almost never show, because tiredness, like grief outside its properly sanctioned mourning period, like illness, like almost every other form of human vulnerability, was simply not a permissible public expression. A woman could not arrive at a dinner party and say honestly that she had slept perhaps 4 hours the previous night, worrying over a household ledger that did not balance, or a rumour she had caught the edge of at another woman's tea table, or a child running a fever the doctor could not quite explain. She arrived, instead, composed, rested-looking, whatever the actual state of her nervous system, because composure was not simply an aesthetic preference in this world. It was, in the fullest sense, a professional requirement, the daily uniform of a job that carried enormous stakes and offered no formal recognition that it was a job at all. I keep circling back to this idea, and I want to be honest that I find it genuinely affecting the more time I spend with it. We are used to thinking about labour in terms of visible output, a ledger balanced, a meal prepared, a garment sewn, something you could point to and say, there, that is what she did today. The labour Adelaide performs, the labour most women of her class and era performed, produced almost nothing you could point to directly. Its entire purpose was to produce the appearance that nothing had needed to be done at all, that the household simply ran itself, that the marriage was simply happy, that the fortune was simply secure, that the woman herself was simply effortlessly exactly what she appeared to be. The better she performed the labour, the more completely it disappeared from view, which meant that the most skilled women in this entire system, the ones managing the most delicate concealments with the greatest grace, received, by definition, the least acknowledgement for what they had actually accomplished. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that arrangement that I think is worth sitting with a while longer. Consider what it would mean to spend an entire adult life being evaluated, constantly, on a performance whose success was measured precisely by how invisible the performance itself remained. Adelaide cannot tell Charles how carefully she has managed this month's accounts, because acknowledging the management would require acknowledging that management was necessary, which would require acknowledging, in turn, that the household's finances were less secure than the marble facade of their Fifth Avenue home suggested. A conversation that would unsettle him in ways she has judged, across years of careful observation, would serve no useful purpose. She cannot tell her own mother about the difficult months following her debut season, about the particular grief of watching a young man she genuinely liked simply disappear from her life without explanation, because that grief too was something a young woman of her position was expected to absorb quietly and never revisit in conversation. She cannot, even now, fully tell Margaret everything, despite the coded conversation over tea, despite the genuine trust between them, because some portion of what she carries has never fully been translated into words even inside her own private thoughts, let alone offered to another person, however trusted, however discreet. This is, I think, the real and lasting human cost of the world we have been exploring together tonight. More than the specific scandals, more than the tightened corsets, more even than the burned letters, though all of those things matter and all of them are true, the cost was a kind of fundamental unknowability that settled over women of this class across the whole span of their lives, an unknowability they participated in constructing themselves, because the system offered them no viable alternative, no safe channel through which a full and honest accounting of an inner life could ever be shared with another human being, not a husband, not a mother, not even in the end a closest friend. I think of the diaries and letters that survive from this era, the ones historians have pieced together from family archives and estate sales and the occasional donation to a historical society, and I notice, reading them now, how often even these ostensibly private documents maintain a kind of careful composure, a reluctance to fully name the specific griefs and fears that must have shaped the writer's actual days. Women wrote about the weather, about social engagements, about their children's health and their husbands' business affairs, in prose that is often lovely, often genuinely observant, and almost never fully candid about the writer's own interior state, because the habit of composure ran so deep, had been trained so thoroughly from girlhood, that it apparently governed even the pages meant for no eyes but the writer's own. A woman who had spent 30 years learning never to say the true difficult thing out loud sometimes, it seems, forgot entirely how to say it even to herself, on paper alone at the end of a long day with no one watching at all. It would be too simple, though, to flatten this into pure tragedy, because I do not think that would be honest either. and because the women themselves, I suspect, would resent having their entire complicated lives reduced to a single note of sorrow. There was pleasure in this world too, genuine pleasure, the satisfaction Adelaide takes in a well-managed dinner party executed flawlessly, the real warmth of an evening with Margaret even inside their careful code, the specific hard-won pride of having built from a family name with dwindling actual resources a secure and respected position across 12 years of unglamorous, unacknowledged, genuinely skillful labor. Adelaide loves her children fiercely in ways that show up in small daily gestures the historical record barely preserves. The extra minutes she spends in the nursery each evening despite an exhausting social calendar. The specific lullaby she sings that her own mother sang to her, one of the very few things passed down between them that required no performance at all, no audience, nothing but the plain, unguarded fact of a mother's voice in a darkened room. But the pleasure and the exhaustion existed together, layered over one another, inseparable, the way they generally do in any genuinely full human life. And I think the honest telling of this history requires holding both at once, rather than choosing one note and playing it exclusively for the length of an entire evening. These were capable, intelligent, often genuinely admirable women, operating with real skill inside a structure that gave them very little credit and very little room, and that they built lives of real substance and real feeling inside that narrow room, rather than how narrow the room itself was, might be the more remarkable part of the story when you sit with it long enough. Let me take you below stairs for a while now, because I think we cannot fully understand the world above without spending some real time in the world that made it possible. The world of the household staff, whose own lives and labour sat underneath every dinner party and every carefully maintained fiction we have discussed tonight, largely unrecorded, and whose silence, as we touched on earlier with Ellen, was itself one of the load-bearing structures of the entire system. A household like Adelaide and Charles's, a substantial but not the very largest Fifth Avenue establishment, might employ somewhere between 10 and 15 indoor servants, a number that sounds enormous to modern ears, and that was, by the standards of the very grandest Gilded Age households, actually quite modest. The truly great houses, the Vanderbilt mansions, the largest of the Newport cottages, employed staffs running to 30, 40, occasionally more, an entire small workforce dedicated to the single purpose of maintaining for one family a standard of living and a standard of appearance that required constant, largely invisible human effort to sustain. The hierarchy below stairs mirrored, in its own way, the hierarchy above, a structure so precise and so carefully maintained that servants themselves were often as attentive to questions of relative status among their own ranks as any society hostess was to the social register. A butler stood at the top of the male staff, responsible for the wine cellar, the silver, the coordination of formal dinners, and the overall discipline of the male servants beneath him, footmen mostly, whose duties ranged from serving at table to answering the door to standing, quite literally, at attention during formal occasions, chosen in some of the grandest households for their height and their matched appearance. Footmen selected in pairs for their similar stature, the way a modern casting director might select matching performers for a specific visual effect. A housekeeper governed the female staff with an authority that, within her own domain, rivaled the lady of the house herself, responsible for the linens, the household accounts as they pertain to domestic supplies, the training and discipline of housemaids and kitchen staff, and the overall smooth running of the domestic machinery that made the family's visible life possible. Beneath her, housemaids performed the endless, physically demanding labor of keeping a mansion of this scale clean and functioning, work that began well before dawn, laying and lighting fires in every room the family would use that day, a task that in a large household might mean 20 or more separate fireplaces requiring individual attention before the family had even woken, and continued through a day of cleaning, carrying, polishing, and the thousand small invisible tasks that a lady of the house never had to think about because they had already been completed by the time she rang for her morning tea. I want to draw a connection here that I think matters because it is easy telling a story like Adelaide's to focus so completely on the particular pressures of her own position that we forget the women working in her household carried burdens of their own, different in kind but not necessarily lesser in weight. A housemaid in a Gilded Age mansion typically worked something close to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that even by the standards of the era were modest, room and board included but personal freedom almost entirely absent, a single half-day off weekly if the household was reasonably generous, and a working life that offered essentially no path toward the kind of security or standing that women like Adelaide, whatever their private exhaustions, ultimately possessed in abundance. And yet there was, I think, a genuine, if deeply unequal, interdependence between these two worlds, above stairs and below, that deserves acknowledgement rather than erasure. Ellen's discretion protected Adelaide, yes, but it also in its way protected Ellen, whose continued employment, whose reputation among other households as a maid who could be trusted with the most delicate confidences, depended entirely on maintaining that discretion completely. A housemaid who gossiped about what she observed in a great house, who was known below stairs and eventually above stairs as unreliable with confidences, would find her employment prospects narrowing considerably in a world where household staff moved between positions largely on the strength of personal recommendation, a letter from a previous employer that could make or break an entire career in domestic service. This meant that the culture below stairs in households across Fifth Avenue and Newport alike developed its own rigorous, largely unwritten code of discretion, not entirely unlike the code that governed the women upstairs, though built from different material necessity. Servants saw everything. They saw the burned letters, or at least the ash. They saw the tightened lacing and understood almost always exactly what it meant. They saw which husbands came home at which hours, which wives received which visitors during which absences, which households were, beneath their marble facades, considerably less financially secure than their public appearance suggested, and overwhelmingly, remarkably, they said very little of it to anyone outside the household. Not necessarily out of loyalty exactly, though loyalty existed too in many of these relationships, genuine over years of service, but out of the same hard practical calculation that governs so much of this entire world. Silence was valuable. Silence was in its own way currency, and servants who understood how to hold it carefully, who understood which observations belonged permanently below stairs, and which occasionally might be worth a careful, discreet mention to a housekeeper or butler who could use the information to protect the household more effectively, built entire careers on precisely that judgment. I find myself thinking when I sit with this part of the story about how many people across a single Gilded Age mansion on any given evening were engaged in some form of careful concealment simultaneously, each for their own reasons, each protecting some portion of the truth from some other portion of the household. An entire elaborate architecture of discretion stacked upon discretion, upstairs and downstairs alike, so that what appeared from the street as a single unified, effortlessly gracious household was, in reality, dozens of individual people, each managing their own private knowledge, their own private silences, their own careful calculations about what could be said and to whom and when. There is another category of secret I want to tell you about now, one that does not get discussed nearly often enough when people talk about this era, and one that touches Adelaide's own circle more closely than she has ever said aloud to anyone, including Margaret. Medicine in the 1890s, particularly the medicine most readily available to women, occupied a strange and often dangerous territory, somewhere between genuine treatment and what we would now recognize immediately as habit-forming, occasionally devastating dependency. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold openly without prescription in most jurisdictions, marketed for an enormous range of complaints: nervous exhaustion, menstrual discomfort, insomnia, what the era vaguely and revealingly called female troubles, a catch-all term that covered everything from genuine gynecological conditions to what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, or the simple crushing exhaustion of a life spent in constant unacknowledged performance. A woman like Adelaide would have had laudanum in her household, quite likely, tucked into a small bottle in her dressing room or her medicine cabinet, prescribed by a family physician for occasional sleeplessness, taken in small, carefully measured doses that felt, to her, entirely reasonable and entirely within the bounds of respectable, doctor-sanctioned self-care. And for many women, that is precisely where the relationship with the medicine remained, occasional, moderate, unremarkable. But for others, and the historical record suggests this was neither rare nor openly discussed, the relationship deepened gradually, almost imperceptibly, from occasional relief into genuine dependency, a slide that the medical understanding of the period was largely unequipped to recognize, let alone treat, because the concept of addiction as we understand it today, a specific, treatable condition rather than simply a moral failing or a sign of an inherently weak constitution, had not yet taken clear shape in mainstream medical thinking. I want to tell you about a woman in Adelaide's wider circle, someone we will call Cornelia, because I think her story illustrates something important that pure statistics never quite manage to convey. Cornelia was, by every outward measure, one of the more successful women of her particular social set, married well, mother to 3 healthy children, hostess of dinners that were genuinely, widely admired for their elegance, and Cornelia had also, over a period of perhaps 4 years, developed a dependence on laudanum that had grown from an occasional evening dose for sleeplessness into something considerably larger, a dependence that shaped her daily rhythms in ways she herself, for a long time, did not fully recognize or was not able to fully admit, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The concealment required to maintain this secret, layered on top of every other concealment we have discussed tonight, was extraordinary in its constancy. Cornelia's lady's maid managed the supply, purchasing small quantities from different pharmacists across the city specifically, so that no single pharmacist would notice and comment on the unusual frequency of her mistress's purchases, a level of coordinated discretion that required the maid's active, ongoing complicity, purchased, in this case, through a combination of genuine personal loyalty built over years and, quite plainly, additional money, paid quietly, outside any formal household accounting, to ensure the arrangement remained entirely private. Cornelia herself learnt to time her doses carefully around her social obligations, managing the particular quality of composed, slightly distant calm the medicine produced in a way that, to observers who did not know precisely what to look for, simply read as elegant, unhurried poise, the very quality that made her dinners so widely admired in the first place. An irony I find genuinely difficult to sit with once you understand it fully. What eventually happened to Cornelia is not fully clear from the fragmentary records that survive, and I do not want to invent a certainty that the historical evidence does not actually support. Some women in her position, we know from the broader pattern of cases documented across the period, eventually sought treatment, often framed publicly again as a rest cure for nervous exhaustion, a sanatorium stay disguised behind the same vague, flexible language that covered so many other concealments in this world. Some managed a kind of ongoing, lifelong equilibrium, never fully free of the dependency but never fully overwhelmed by it either, a precarious balance maintained through the same constant vigilance that governed every other aspect of their carefully performed lives. And some, tragically, did not manage the balance at all, and the historical record here goes quiet in a way that I think is its own kind of evidence. Families who simply stopped speaking of a particular woman's later years, obituaries that mention a long illness without ever specifying its nature, a silence so complete and so carefully maintained that it has taken modern historians considerable effort, working from scattered private letters and occasional physician's notes that survived by accident rather than intention, to even partially reconstruct what actually happened to some of these women. I share this with you not to darken the evening unnecessarily, but because I think it belongs in any honest telling of what concealment actually cost in this world. The system we have spent this whole night describing, the tightened corset, the burned letter, the coded conversation over tea, protected women in real and meaningful ways, gave them real tools for facing genuine danger in a world with very few other tools available to them. But the same system, built as it was on the absolute premise that vulnerability could never be safely shown to anyone, also meant that a woman sliding into genuine crisis, whether a crisis of the body or a crisis of the mind, had almost no path toward help that did not require the same exhausting, potentially dangerous concealment that governed every other part of her life. The very skill that kept Adelaide's secrets safe in her dressing room, the skill of appearing, always exactly as composed as the moment required, was the same skill that could in a different woman's life, in Cornelia's life, quietly conceal a genuine emergency until it had grown far larger and far more dangerous than it might have become in a world that permitted an honest asking for help. Let me tell you about the wedding now, the one Adelaide is meant to host in April for Charles's niece, because I think it will show you in concentrated form almost everything we have discussed tonight, and because weddings in this world reveal, more clearly than almost any other single event, exactly how much labour sat behind every appearance of effortless celebration. A society wedding of this period, for a family of Charles's standing, was not a single day's event but a months-long campaign, not unlike the debutante campaigns we discussed earlier, requiring the same careful coordination, the same attention to 1,000 small details, each carrying its own social weight. The engagement itself, once formally announced, triggered an immediate cascade of obligations, calls to be made and received, congratulating the family and being congratulated in turn, notices to be placed in the correct newspapers, worded with exquisite care, because even an engagement announcement carried coded information, the specific language used to describe the groom's family, the order in which various relatives were mentioned, all of it read and interpreted by the same watchful eyes that read everything else in this world. The trousseau alone represented an undertaking of genuine scale, an entire wardrobe assembled for the bride's married life, commissioned from the finest dressmakers available to the family, sometimes including garments ordered directly from Paris, from the great couture houses whose names, Worth chief among them, carried a prestige that American dressmakers, however skilled, simply could not match in the eyes of society's most discerning judges. A proper trousseau might include dozens of individual garments, morning dresses and afternoon dresses and evening gowns and travelling costumes and morning clothes, prepared in advance against the eventual, inevitable losses that even a young bride's life would someday include, an entire wardrobe designed to carry a young woman through every conceivable social circumstance of her new married life, assembled, fitted and paid for months before the wedding day itself, at an expense that, added to the cost of the ceremony and the reception that would follow it, could easily run to a sum that would have supported an ordinary working family for a decade or more. Adelaide's specific role in all of this, as the wife of the bride's uncle and, given her own considerable social standing built over 12 careful years, one of the more prominent hostesses in the extended family's circle, involves hosting a series of events in the weeks surrounding the wedding itself. A luncheon for the bride and her closest friends, an afternoon reception introducing the groom's family more formally to the wider circle, and the wedding breakfast itself, the large formal reception following the ceremony, which will be held, given the scale of the guest list under discussion, at Adelaide and Charles's own home, transforming their household, for one extraordinary day, into a kind of theatre capable of receiving several hundred guests, with the same seamless, effortless grace that governed every smaller event Adelaide had ever hosted. The planning for this single day, I want you to understand, has already consumed months of Adelaide's attention, running in parallel with everything else we have discussed tonight. The pregnancy she has carried in secret, and then, more recently, carried openly but carefully timed. The household ledger she balances in silence. The correspondence she maintains across dozens of relationships that all require careful, constant tending. She has met with caterers to plan a menu that will honor the occasion without appearing to compete inappropriately with the wedding itself. A delicate calibration of extravagance that took considerable diplomatic skill to manage, because a reception that appeared too grand risked the appearance of upstaging the bride's own family, while a reception that appeared insufficiently generous risked reflecting poorly on Charles's branch of the family in front of several hundred of society's most attentive witnesses. She has coordinated with florists, with musicians, with the household staff, whose own workload across the weeks surrounding the wedding will expand to something close to round the clock. And she has done all of this while managing her own body's changing needs, timing fittings for her own wedding-appropriate gown around a waistline that Ellen has been managing with quiet, expert care for months now. I think there is something worth pausing on here. Something about the sheer accumulated weight of simultaneous obligation that women like Adelaide carried as an ordinary condition of their lives, not as an unusual crisis, but as the baseline expectation against which everything else had to be managed. We have spent this whole evening walking through individual threads of concealment and labor, the corset, the ledger, the burned letter, the coded conversation, as though each existed somewhat separately, its own discrete challenge to be solved and set aside. But Adelaide does not experience them separately. She experiences them simultaneously, continuously, 100 threads held at once, each requiring its own careful attention, each capable of unraveling the others if mismanaged, for months and years on end, without any real prospect of the burden lightening significantly at any foreseeable point in her future. The wedding day itself, when it finally arrives on a bright, cold morning in April, unfolds, from the perspective of the several hundred guests who attend it, exactly as it is meant to unfold, flawlessly. The ceremony at a fashionable Fifth Avenue church, the bride in a gown that draws the appropriate murmur of admiration as she moves up the aisle. The reception afterward at Adelaide and Charles's home, every room transformed with flowers and careful lighting, every guest greeted with precisely the correct degree of warmth calibrated to their own standing. Every detail, down to the particular arrangement of place cards at the breakfast tables, executed with a precision that reads, to anyone watching, as simple, natural grace, the kind of effortless elegance that Adelaide has spent 12 years learning to produce, and that nobody in that receiving line, accepting her warm, unhurried greeting, has any reason to suspect required anything at all beyond the natural inclination of a gracious hostess. Adelaide herself, standing in the receiving line for the better part of 2 hours, 5 months along now, and dressed in a gown Ellen has altered with such skill that not a single guest comments on anything beyond how well she looks, feels, somewhere beneath the composed warmth of her greeting, a specific and familiar exhaustion settling into her lower back, into her feet, into the particular fatigue that comes from standing, smiling, and performing genuine interest in several hundred individual conversations across a single long afternoon. Nobody sees this. That is, in the end, the entire point of everything we have discussed tonight. The whole elaborate architecture of concealment and management and careful, constant labor. Nobody sees it, and the not being seen, the successful, complete invisibility of the effort, is itself the measure of how well Adelaide has done her job. Let me tell you now about what happened after, because I think you have earned the resolution of this particular thread, and because the answer reveals one more layer of concealment we have not yet discussed tonight, the concealment that surrounded childbirth itself in this world. A woman of Adelaide's standing did not simply have a baby in the casual, public sense that phrase might suggest to modern ears. She entered what was called confinement, a period beginning several weeks before the expected date and continuing for a period afterward, during which she withdrew almost entirely from public life, receiving no calls, making no appearances. The whole elaborate social machinery of her ordinary existence simply paused, without comment, without explanation required, because confinement itself was one of the few conditions in this world that required no coded language at all. everyone understood exactly what it meant, and everyone extended for its duration the specific, unusual courtesy of simply not asking further questions. The birth itself took place at home, attended by a physician and, quite likely, a nurse engaged specifically for the lying-in period, in the same bedroom where Adelaide slept every other night of her married life. The same room where, months earlier, she had stood before her mirror while Ellen worked the laces a half-inch tighter than usual. There is something I find myself circling back to, thinking about this. The way the room itself held both moments, the concealment and the culmination, separated by 5 months and containing, in a sense, the entire arc of the secret we opened this evening with. Childbirth in 1895 carried real danger that a modern listener, accustomed to the medical safety we now largely take for granted, might not fully appreciate. Puerperal fever, an infection contracted during or after delivery, remained a genuine and serious threat throughout this period, killing women across every social class, though wealthy women had access, at least, to physicians more likely to have adopted the increasingly understood principles of antiseptic practice that had begun spreading through American medicine over the preceding 2 decades, even if adoption remained frustratingly uneven from doctor to doctor and household to household. Adelaide's own mother had lost a sister to exactly this cause, a fact the family discussed, when it discussed it at all, in the same hushed, careful language reserved for every other difficult truth in this world, and Adelaide carried that history with her into her own confinement, a quiet fear she shared with no one, not even Margaret, not even Ellen, because some fears she had learnt across a lifetime of careful composure simply had no acceptable place to be spoken aloud. The child, when it arrived, was a girl, small and healthy, born on a cold night in late October, with a competence and a speed that the physician later described, in the careful, slightly formal language doctors of the period favoured, as a straightforward delivery, a phrase that told Adelaide almost nothing about what those hours had actually felt like from the inside, the specific quality of pain that no etiquette manual had ever prepared her for, the strange, overwhelming rush of relief and love that arrived, finally, sometime past midnight, when Ellen placed the child in her arms, and the whole elaborate architecture of concealment that had governed the preceding months simply, for a few hours at least, ceased to matter at all. I want to sit with that moment for a while, because I think it is important, and because it offers something different from everything else we have discussed tonight. In that room past midnight, exhausted beyond anything the social season had ever demanded of her, Adelaide was not performing anything. There was no audience to manage, no ledger to balance, no letter requiring careful destruction. There was only the child and her own body's profound, uncomplicated exhaustion, and Ellen moving quietly around the room attending to the small necessary tasks of the aftermath, and Charles admitted finally, sitting beside the bed with an expression on his face that Adelaide had not seen from him since their own wedding day, something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with the careful, formal love that generally governed their marriage's outward performance. This did not last, of course. By morning, the machinery of the wider world had already begun reasserting itself, the birth announcement to be worded correctly and sent to the appropriate newspapers, the calls that would begin arriving once the customary interval of confinement had passed, the christening to be planned, itself another event, requiring careful management of guest lists and precedents and the correct degree of ceremony appropriate to the family's standing. But that one night, I think, deserves to be remembered separately from everything that followed it. A small, genuine, entirely unperformed hour inside a life that offered very few of them, and I find something quietly moving in simply how it happened at all, that even inside a system built almost entirely around concealment and appearance, moments of complete, unguarded truth still occasionally broke through, unbidden, uncalculated, arriving exactly when they were needed most. The timeline held in the end. Nobody, as far as Adelaide could ever determine, performed the arithmetic that Louisa's accusers had once performed so readily over a mere seating chart. Perhaps the wedding she had hosted so flawlessly in April had brought her more grace than she realized, a household that had just demonstrated in front of several hundred witnesses exactly the kind of effortless competence that this world rewarded with the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps women who might otherwise have wondered simply chose, out of their own complicated mixture of genuine goodwill and the same unspoken mutual protection we discussed earlier tonight, not to look too closely. Perhaps, and I think this is likely closer to the truth than any single explanation, the whole question simply mattered less than Adelaide's exhausted, frightened calculations in that dressing room had led her to fear it would, one thread among the many she had been managing simultaneously, resolved quietly, without incident, the way most of these private crises actually resolved themselves in this world. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful, patient, largely invisible management, sustained long enough for the danger to simply pass. I want to slow down even further now, because I think we have covered enough of the mechanics of this world, the cards and the corsets and the ledgers, and what remains is something quieter, something I want to give you room to simply feel rather than learn. Think about the particular texture of an evening in this world, the hour just after the last guests have gone and just before sleep finally arrives. The gas lamps turned low, then out entirely, leaving only perhaps a single candle or a small oil lamp in a private dressing room. The specific smell of a house at that hour, wax and coal smoke, and the lingering trace of whatever flowers had decorated the drawing room that evening, roses most likely, or hothouse lilies if the season and the budget allowed, their scent grown slightly heavier and sweeter in the closed, warm air of a room that had held 200 people just hours earlier and now held only one. The particular quiet of a large house settling for the night, the small sounds of a fire dying down in a grate somewhere below, the creak of a floorboard as a servant made a final round securing doors and windows, sounds so familiar to anyone who lived inside houses of this era that they barely registered as sound at all. Simply the ordinary texture of night arriving. Adelaide, across the many years we have followed her tonight, in some form or another, experienced this same hour thousands of times. The unlacing, the 100 strokes of a brush through hair that Ellen, or whoever her maid happened to be across the different years of her life, performed with the same patient, practiced rhythm each night, a small physical ritual that, whatever else the day had held, remained essentially constant, essentially hers across decades, the cream applied to hands roughened, despite everything, by years of managing a household even a woman of her position could not fully insulate from actual physical labor, the specific weight of a blanket pulled up in a room where the fire had been banked but not entirely extinguished, because a house this size could never be kept fully warm through an entire winter night, and every bedroom in New York's grandest mansions carried, somewhere in its far corners, a chill that money simply could not fully banish. I think about Ellen too in these quiet hours, because her own night did not end when Adelaide's began. She would retire to her own small room, considerably smaller than the dressing room she had just left, furnished simply but not without care, a narrow bed, a small chest for her own modest possessions, perhaps a single framed photograph of her own family, parents or siblings she had left behind somewhere, Ireland most likely, given the demographics of domestic service in this era in New York, a family she supported, in part, with the wages she earned dressing another woman's hair and managing another woman's secrets. Ellen's own life, her own private hopes, whatever they were, whatever she thought about in the quiet minutes before her own sleep arrived, exists almost entirely outside the historical record, a silence within the silence, a woman whose entire professional value depended on her discretion, and whose own interior life has, as a direct consequence, come down to us across more than a century as close to a complete blank. This asymmetry is worth naming plainly, I think, because it matters. We have spent this whole evening exploring Adelaide's concealments, her fears, her private griefs, reconstructed, in the composite way I mentioned near the beginning, from the letters and diaries and etiquette manuals and social histories that survive from women of her class. Ellen's version of this same night, the version from below stairs, survives in almost no comparable detail anywhere, not because her inner life was any less rich or any less real, but because nobody in this world, not the newspapers, not the social historians of the era, not even, in most cases, the families who employed women like her for decades, considered her interior experience worth the paper it would have taken to record it. This too, I think, is part of the honest telling of this history, the recognition that even within a story about women whose own labour went systematically unacknowledged, there existed another layer beneath them, other women whose labour and whose humanity received even less acknowledgement still. Let me tell you what became of Adelaide. In the broad outline, the historical pattern of women like her generally followed, because I think the shape of an entire life, sketched gently, serves this hour of the night better than any single dramatic climax could. She continued, across the following 15 years or so, much as she had before, the seasons rolling forward one into the next, each with its own particular configuration of obligations and small crises successfully, quietly managed. Her daughter, the one born on that cold October night, grew up inside the same system, absorbed the same etiquette manuals, endured her own debutante season with its own careful maternal oversight, made eventually her own marriage, one Adelaide managed with all the accumulated skill of her own hard-won experience, steering her daughter, as her own mother had once steered her, toward a match that answered the family's practical needs while trying, in the small ways available to her, to give her daughter more genuine voice in the decision than she herself had been permitted at the same age. A modest but real shift, one small generation's worth of softening in a system that would take considerably longer than one generation to soften significantly further. Charla's fortune weathered the financial panics that punctuated this entire era, the periodic market contractions that could and did ruin families who had built their position on securities and speculation, rather than the older, steadier forms of wealth that families like the Vandermeers had accumulated across generations. It weathered them in large part because of exactly the kind of careful, invisible household management Adelaide had practiced for years before anyone in her family fully understood how necessary that management actually was. The quiet decisions about which expenses could wait, which extravagances could be delayed without visible cost to the family's standing, the whole patient architecture of concealment that had begun, all those years earlier, with a corset laced a half-inch tighter than usual, expanding gradually into a genuine sustained talent for keeping a household's fortunes secure through means her own husband, for most of their marriage, never fully understood or fully appreciated. She grew older, as everyone does, and the particular exhausting vigilance of her younger years softened gradually into something calmer, not because the world around her had changed especially, the rules remained largely the rules, but because a woman of established, secure standing in her 50s occupied a considerably less precarious position than the same woman had occupied in her 30s, still building, still proving, still one misstep away from real danger. Margaret remained her closest friend across all of it, the two women growing old together in the particular way that women who have shared real secrets across real decades sometimes do, their coded language softening over the years into something closer to plain speech, though never quite entirely plain, because some habits, learnt early enough and practiced long enough, simply become part of how a person exists in the world, regardless of whether the original danger that necessitated them has actually passed. I want to widen the lens now just a little before we come back to Adelaide one final time, because I think it helps to understand what eventually happened to this entire world. The whole gilded structure of calling cards and coded conversations and tightly laced secrets that we have spent this evening exploring in such close particular detail. The Gilded Age, as a distinct social and economic period, did not end abruptly. It faded gradually across the first 2 decades of the 20th century, worn down by forces that had already begun gathering strength even in the 1890s, though few people living inside Adelaide's world would have recognized them clearly at the time. the progressive movement, gaining real political momentum through the 1890s and accelerating sharply after the turn of the century, brought increasing public scrutiny to exactly the kind of enormous, largely unaccountable private fortunes that had built the Fifth Avenue mansions and the Newport cottages in the first place. Journalists, the ones history would later call muckrakers, began publishing detailed, damning accounts of how fortunes like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies had actually been assembled, the labor practices, the market manipulations, the human costs that the marble facades had been specifically designed to obscure from public view. A federal income tax established permanently with the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913 changed the practical economics of maintaining a household on the scale Adelaide and Charles had built theirs, gradually making the truly enormous domestic staffs and the truly enormous houses considerably harder to sustain across succeeding generations. The First World War, when it arrived, disrupted the entire social calendar that had structured women's lives so completely, cancelling seasons, redirecting enormous amounts of female energy and organisational skill, the very same skills Adelaide had spent decades honing in service of dinner parties and calling card etiquette toward war relief work, nursing, and organizational efforts that gave many women of this class their first real, public, socially sanctioned outlet for exactly the competence they had been quietly exercising all along, unacknowledged behind closed doors. I find something genuinely poignant in that particular shift when I sit with it. The same skills that had once gone entirely into the invisible labor of managing a household's appearance, the careful attention to detail, the capacity to coordinate enormous logistical undertakings while appearing entirely unhurried, the ability to manage difficult, delicate situations requiring both firmness and tact, translated almost seamlessly into the work of organizing hospital supplies, coordinating volunteer nurses, managing the enormous administrative apparatus that wartime relief efforts required. Women who had spent their entire adult lives being told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that their labor did not count as real work, discovered almost by accident that the very same labor, redirected toward a visibly urgent public purpose, suddenly did count, suddenly earned acknowledgement, gratitude even, in some cases formal recognition that a lifetime of flawlessly executed dinner parties never had. By the 1920s, the world Adelaide had spent her entire adult life mastering had changed almost beyond recognition. The strict hierarchy of old money and new money had softened considerably, worn down partly by the simple passage of time, which eventually makes every fortune old, and partly by a cultural shift that increasingly valued visible success and personal reinvention over inherited pedigree. The rigid etiquette of calling cards and formal morning calls, already beginning to feel dated by the 1910s, largely disappeared from ordinary practice within the following decade, replaced by faster, less ceremonial forms of social contact that a woman of Adelaide's mother's generation would have found almost unrecognizably casual. The corsets themselves, the specific instrument of concealment that opened our story tonight, fell out of fashion with startling speed in the years following the war, replaced by the looser, more comfortable silhouettes that a new generation of women, many of whom had spent the war years in far more practical clothing than any fashionable corset would have permitted, simply refused to abandon once peacetime returned. Adelaide, by this point somewhere in her 60s, watched this transformation from a position of established comfortable security, no longer needing to prove anything to anyone, her own daughter now managing a household and a marriage of her own, in a world that demanded, in certain narrow but genuine respects, somewhat less constant concealment than the world Adelaide herself had lived through at the same age. I do not want to overstate this shift, because the deeper structures of expectation placed on women, the demand for composure, the disproportionate burden of managing a household's reputation and its finances, the whole architecture of unacknowledged domestic labor, did not disappear with the corsets and the calling cards. They simply changed their outward form, adapted to new fashions and new social customs, while the underlying weight in many respects continued forward largely unchanged, carried by new generations of women who would have recognized, I think, a great deal more of Adelaide's inner experience than the surface details of their considerably more comfortable, considerably less rigidly structured lives might initially suggest. I think this is in the end part of why this story feels worth telling now, more than a century later, to you lying in the dark, listening. Not because the specific details, the corsets, the calling cards, the 11 weeks so carefully concealed behind a half-inch of extra lacing, describe a world any of us actually inhabit anymore. They do not. But because the underlying shape of what Adelaide carried, the exhaustion of constant performance, the loneliness of being evaluated on a labour whose success depended entirely on its own invisibility, the particular ache of loving people you cannot fully be honest with because honesty itself has never been modelled to you as safe. These things, I think, have not vanished from human experience nearly as completely as the corsets and calling cards have. They have simply changed their costume the way they always do, generation after generation, waiting to be recognized again by whoever happens to be paying close enough attention. Before we return finally to that quiet dressing room where we began, I want to tell you about a few of the women who did in fact find ways to step outside this system, at least partially, because I think their stories deserve a place in tonight's telling, even if Adelaide herself was never quite one of them, and even if their exceptions in the end prove exactly how rigid the ordinary rule actually was. Alva Vanderbilt, who married into one of the great new money families of the era, and who spent much of her early married life fighting the exact same battle for acceptance that shapes so much of what we discuss tonight regarding old money and new, eventually became one of the most consequential social strategists of the entire Gilded Age, orchestrating, among other things, a legendary costume ball in 1883 specifically designed to force Mrs. Astor herself to finally publicly acknowledge the Vanderbilt family's standing, a maneuver so successful and so widely discussed that it essentially completed the Vanderbilts' passage from new money to permanently, unquestionably established. Alva later became, in a turn that would have seemed almost unimaginable to a younger version of herself, still fighting for a place on the guest list, one of the era's most prominent and outspoken suffragists, funding the movement generously and speaking publicly, in her later years, in terms considerably more direct and considerably more critical of the entire social system she had once fought so hard to enter than almost anyone else of her class and generation dared to use. There is something I find genuinely striking about that particular arc. A woman who spent decades mastering the exact rules of concealment and performance we have spent this whole evening discussing, who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how the machinery of social acceptance and social exclusion actually worked, eventually turning that same hard-won understanding toward dismantling parts of the system that had shaped her, arguing in her later public statements that women deserved a political voice precisely because she had spent so many years watching, firsthand, how completely women's actual influence and actual labor went unacknowledged within a structure that formally excluded them from any real power at all. Edith Wharton, born into exactly this world, the daughter of an old New York family with all the social standing and all the rigid expectation that entailed, chose a different kind of exit, one built through observation rather than confrontation. Her novels, written in the decades following the period we have spent tonight exploring, captured, with a precision that still reads as remarkably sharp, more than a century later, exactly the mechanisms of concealment, reputation, and quiet social destruction we have discussed this evening, the rumors that could ruin a woman regardless of truth, the elaborate unspoken rules that governed every gesture, the particular loneliness of women whose entire lives were shaped by forces they could see clearly but rarely control directly. Wharton understood this world from the inside in a way that gave her fiction an unusual, often uncomfortable authority, and reading her novels now, knowing the specific historical texture we have spent this evening building together, you can feel, I think, exactly how much lived observation sits behind every carefully constructed social scene she wrote. I do not think it is an accident that both of these women, Alva Vanderbilt and Edith Wharton found their way towards some form of genuine voice only by first mastering, completely and exhaustively, the very system that had initially constrained them. This seems to me one of the quieter truths buried inside tonight's story. The women who eventually found ways to speak plainly about this world were, almost without exception, women who had first spent years, sometimes decades, learning to speak its coded, careful, indirect language fluently enough to understand precisely what it was actually protecting and precisely what it was actually costing. Adelaide never became a suffragist. She never wrote a novel. Her particular exceptional quality, if we can call it that, expressed itself entirely within the narrower, more private sphere available to her. The management of a household, the raising of a daughter she tried, in small ways, to give slightly more freedom than she herself had received. The sustained, decades-long friendship with Margaret that survived every crisis this world could throw at it. This is, I think, the more representative story, the one that describes the actual lived experience of the overwhelming majority of women in Adelaide's position, women whose considerable capability never found a public stage at all, women whose entire skill and intelligence went, instead, into the quiet, unglamorous, endlessly demanding work of keeping a private world intact. There is one more thing I want to say before we let Adelaide go for the night. Something about the specific quality of intimacy that existed between women like her and Margaret, because I think it is easy, hearing a story built so heavily around concealment and performance, to imagine that genuine connection had no real place in this world at all. That is not quite right, and I do not want to leave you with that impression. The friendship between Adelaide and Margaret, sustained across more than 4 decades by the time we leave them tonight, was built almost entirely within the narrow channels this world permitted. The coded conversations over tea, the careful favours exchanged and never directly acknowledged, the quiet countryside retreat offered without ever requiring an explicit request. And yet within those narrow channels, something genuinely real took root and held, a trust deep enough that Adelaide, across her entire adult life, never once had cause to regret the confidence she had placed in Margaret that morning after the ball, a friendship that outlasted both women's husbands, that carried them both through the ordinary griefs of aging, illness, the loss of parents, and eventually, for Margaret, the loss of a child, a category of grief so profound that even this rigid, careful world made some small, genuine room for a friend's unperformed presence, sitting quietly beside a woman whose composure had for once entirely and understandably failed her. I think real intimacy, even inside the most constrained systems humans build for themselves, tends to find whatever narrow channel remains available to it, and flows through that channel with a persistence that the system itself never fully anticipates or fully controls. Adelaide's world gave her very little room for honesty, but the room it gave her, narrow as it was, held enough for one genuine friendship to survive an entire lifetime inside it. And I think that fact, small as it might seem set against everything else we have discussed tonight, deserves to be remembered as clearly as any of the harder truths. Let me tell you now about the objects that outlived her, because I think objects, more than almost anything else, carry the honest residue of a life once all the performance has finally ended, and because I want you to picture them clearly before we close this story out completely. Adelaide died, in the pattern this composite story generally follows, sometime in her early 80s, in the 1940s, in a world that would have seemed almost entirely foreign to the young woman who had once stood before a mirror on Fifth Avenue calculating a corset's lacing down to the half-inch. Her daughter, by then middle-aged herself, and her granddaughters, young women coming of age in a world of considerably more freedom, though still, in its own ways, shaped by expectations their great-grandmother would have recognized instantly, went through her belongings in the weeks following her death, the ordinary, quietly devastating task that falls to every family eventually, sorting through the accumulated physical evidence of an entire long life. They found the garnet necklace, still in its velvet case, the one Adelaide had considered, all those decades earlier, quietly selling and replacing with a skillful paste copy during one of the leaner financial seasons of her early marriage, though in the end, the historical record of this particular composite detail suggests she never quite brought herself to actually do it, keeping the real stones instead, through some combination of sentiment and perhaps simple reluctance to fully surrender one small, tangible piece of the security her marriage to Charles had represented. They found letters, considerably fewer than a woman of her correspondence must have actually written and received across 60 years of adult life, because we know, having spent this whole evening discussing exactly this practice, how thoroughly women like Adelaide burned the letters that mattered most, keeping only the safer, more ordinary correspondence, birthday notes, holiday greetings, the kind of paper trail that revealed nothing beyond the entirely respectable, entirely unremarkable outline of a well-lived, well-managed life. Tucked into the back of a drawer in her writing desk, they found the small leather ledger, the one Adelaide had kept hidden from Charles for the better part of 4 decades. Its pages filled with the careful, coded arithmetic of a household's real financial life, entries that would have meant almost nothing to anyone who did not already understand the particular language of delayed payments and quietly managed extravagances that we have spent this whole evening learning to read. Her granddaughter, finding it, apparently understood almost immediately what she was looking at, though the specific account of this recognition, like so much of this story, comes down to us only in fragments, family stories passed down and reshaped across succeeding generations, the way family stories always are. And they found, this is the detail I find myself returning to most often, thinking about tonight's story, a small framed photograph, taken sometime in the 1920s, of Adelaide and Margaret together, 2 elderly women sitting on a porch somewhere, dressed in the considerably simpler, considerably more comfortable fashions of their later years, both of them laughing at something the photograph itself cannot tell us, some joke or memory shared between 2 people who had known each other, by that point, for well over 50 years. It is, by every account that survives, one of the very few photographs of Adelaide in which she appears entirely unguarded, entirely without the careful, composed expression she had spent an entire lifetime perfecting, caught for one accidental instant in a moment of genuine, uncalculated happiness that no etiquette manual had ever needed to teach her, because it required, for once, no performance at all. I want you to hold that image for a moment, because I think it offers something true and something gentle to carry out of this story with you tonight. A whole life of careful concealment, of tightened lacing and burned letters and coded conversations, and at the very end of it, preserved by accident in a single unposed photograph, one genuine, unguarded laugh, shared with the one person who had known, across more than half a century, almost everything there was to know, and had kept every single piece of it exactly as safe as Adelaide had once needed it to be. This is, in the end, I think, the truest thing tonight's story has to offer you, that the concealment we have spent this whole evening exploring, real and exhausting and genuinely costly as it was, never actually succeeded in erasing the woman underneath it, not entirely, not permanently. It shaped her without question, constrained her, cost her things she never fully got back. But somewhere beneath the corset and the calling cards and the careful coded language, a whole genuine person persisted, capable, across an entire long lifetime, of real friendship, real love for her children, real moments of unguarded laughter on a porch somewhere, decades after the last ball had ended and the last debt had been quietly settled and the last rumour had finally mercifully run out of energy and faded away into the general, forgiving silence that eventually settles over almost everything given enough time. Let us slow all the way down now, because I think we are close to the end of this particular story, and I want to bring you gently back to where we started one final time before I let you go. Picture the dressing room again. Not the one from the beginning of tonight's story, the one with the single low lamp and the 11 weeks and the half-inch of extra lacing, though that room is still there, still part of everything we have discussed. Picture, instead, a later version of the same room, the same house, decades on, the gas lamps long since replaced by electric light, the fashions in the wardrobe entirely different from anything Adelaide wore as a young bride, and an older woman, 60 perhaps, or 70, sitting at the same dressing table, in the same quiet hour after everyone else in the house has gone to sleep. Her hair grey now, brushed out by hands that have grown slower and more careful over the years, but that still, out of long habit, count the strokes without quite meaning to. 100, the same number Ellen taught her all those decades earlier, a small private ritual that survived every other change this long life brought with it. She sits for a while, this older Adelaide, not doing anything in particular, simply sitting in the particular quiet of a large house at that late hour, the specific quiet we described earlier tonight, the settling floorboards, the last coals dying somewhere below, the faint, familiar scent of a room that has held 60 years of this same nightly ritual. And I think if we could somehow ask her, in this quiet moment, whether the whole enormous architecture of concealment and performance we have spent this evening exploring had been worth what it cost her, I do not think she would give us a simple answer. I do not think there is a simple answer to give, but I think she would tell us, if she told us anything at all, that she had built a life inside the narrow room this world allowed her, that held more genuine substance than the marble facade outside her window had ever fully suggested. A marriage that became, over decades, something close to real partnership, despite its formal beginnings. A daughter she had loved fiercely and had tried in small ways to free from at least some of the narrowest constraints of her own girlhood. A friendship with Margaret that had held unbroken through every crisis this world could produce for more than 50 years. And a private interior life, glimpsed only occasionally, only by the people closest to her. Ellen, who dressed her for decades and never once spoke of what she witnessed. Margaret, who understood everything without requiring it explained, that had remained, somehow, beneath every layer of careful performance, genuinely and unmistakably her own. I want to give you a few more glimpses before we close tonight, brief ones, because I think the fullest way to understand this world is not through one woman's story alone, however carefully we have built it, but through the accumulated weight of many women's stories, each carrying their own particular version of the same essential burden. There was a woman, documented in fragments across several surviving letters from the period, whose husband's fortune, built on a speculative railroad venture in the Western Territories, collapsed almost entirely during the financial panic of 1893, one of the more severe economic contractions of the era. A collapse that reduced dozens of formerly wealthy families to genuine financial precarity within a matter of months. This particular woman spent nearly 2 years managing an elaborate, exhausting fiction of continued prosperity, selling jewelry piece by piece through the same kind of discreet dealers we discussed earlier, letting go of servants quietly, one at a time rather than all at once, in a way that avoided the sudden, visible reduction in staff that would have signaled the family's true situation to every other household on the street, and continuing to appear at the social events her diminished means could no longer comfortably afford, because withdrawing entirely would have confirmed, publicly and immediately, exactly the collapse she was working so desperately to conceal. She succeeded remarkably in maintaining the fiction long enough for her husband to rebuild a portion of the family's fortune through a subsequent, more cautious venture, and the full extent of what those 2 years had actually cost her, financially and otherwise, never became widely known in her social circle at all, a private catastrophe managed entirely alone, behind a facade that never once, as far as the surviving record shows, visibly cracked. Another woman's story survives too, and this account comes to us more directly through a diary that survived in a family archive and was eventually donated to a historical society decades later, who spent the better part of a decade managing her husband's increasingly apparent, increasingly difficult to conceal drinking, a condition the etiquette and medical language of the era addressed only obliquely through euphemisms about a gentleman's nervous constitution or his need for quiet and rest, language that placed the entire burden of managing the actual, practical consequences, the missed appointments, the occasional public embarrassments, the genuine danger to the household's finances that his condition periodically created, on his wife, who developed across those years an entire private system for managing crises before they became visible to the wider world. Servants trained to intercept and redirect, invitations declined with carefully vague explanations, an entire architecture of concealment not unlike everything we have discussed tonight, but built around a different kind of secret entirely, one she carried, by her own account in that surviving diary, with an exhaustion so complete that she describes in one particularly striking entry, feeling as though she had two entirely separate lives. One performed in daylight for the benefit of everyone who knew her, and one lived only in the private hours after midnight, in her own thoughts, where the truth of her actual circumstances was permitted to exist at all. A third woman enters here too, younger than the others, barely into her 20s, whose engagement to a promising young man from an excellent family was quietly permanently dissolved after a rumour, never fully substantiated, never directly confronted, suggested some impropriety in her behaviour during a house party the previous summer. A rumour built, much like Louisa's story earlier tonight, from almost nothing. A glance held a moment too long, a walk in a garden unchaperoned for perhaps 10 minutes longer than strict propriety technically allowed. She never married in the end, not because any concrete evidence of wrongdoing ever surfaced, none did, but because the rumour itself, unproven and unprovable, proved sufficient to make her a less attractive prospect to the small circle of families whose sons might otherwise have considered her, and she spent the remaining decades of her long life in the diminished, dependent position we discussed earlier, first in her father's household, and later, after his death, in her brother's. Her considerable intelligence and genuine warmth, remembered fondly by nieces and nephews in later family recollections, finding almost no outlet at all, beyond the narrow domestic role that an unmarried woman of her class was permitted to occupy. I share these 3 brief stories with you, alongside Adelaide's fuller one, because I want you to understand that what we have spent this evening exploring was not one woman's unusual misfortune. It was the ordinary weather of an entire world, a pattern repeated with endless small variations across thousands of households, thousands of women, each of them managing their own particular version of the same essential task, keeping a fragile, carefully constructed appearance intact against whatever specific threat happened to be pressing against it in any given season: financial collapse, a husband's difficulty, an unproven rumour, an inconveniently timed pregnancy, the specific content changing from household to household while the underlying labour, the underlying isolation, the underlying cost remained remarkably, almost hauntingly consistent. And I think if there is one thing I would want you to carry with you as you drift off tonight, it is not simply the historical detail, fascinating as I hope you have found it, the calling cards and the corsets and the coded conversations over tea. It is something a little larger than that, something about the particular quiet courage it takes to keep managing a difficult situation day after day without recognition, without complaint, simply because the people you love need you to keep managing it. That kind of courage rarely makes it into the history books. It rarely makes it into anyone's memory at all, beyond the small circle of people who happen to witness it directly, and sometimes not even then. But it was real in Adelaide's life and in the lives of the thousands of women like her, and I think it deserves even now, even from this distance of more than a century, to be recognised, quietly, gently, the way we are recognizing it together tonight. Let me give you the city itself for a while now, because I think we have spent so much time inside these private rooms tonight that it is worth remembering before we close what New York actually felt like around all of this, the wider world these particular concealments existed inside. Fifth Avenue in the 1890s, the stretch running roughly from Washington Square up through the 50s and 60s where the greatest mansions stood, was by day a carefully choreographed procession of carriages and pedestrians, women in elaborate afternoon dress taking the fashionable hour for walking or riding, precisely the kind of visible public performance we have discussed throughout tonight's story, an entire street functioning as a kind of open-air stage where standing could be silently confirmed or quietly questioned based on nothing more than who was seen walking with whom, at what hour, in what company. By night, the same street transformed into something quieter, and in its way, more honest gas lamps and, increasingly through this decade, the newer electric lighting that Edison's company had begun installing across portions of the city, throwing long shadows against limestone facades that had cost more to build than most people watching from the sidewalk would earn across several lifetimes. Beyond Fifth Avenue, though, in the same city, at the same hour, an entirely different New York existed. One that the women inside those mansions rarely saw directly and thought about, if at all, only in the abstracted, distant way that great wealth generally permits itself to consider great poverty. The Lower East Side, packed with recent immigrants living in conditions of crowding and hardship that Jacob Riis had begun documenting in exactly this period, in photographs and writing that would eventually help spark some of the progressive reforms we touched on earlier. Domestic servants themselves, the Ellens of this world, often came from exactly these neighborhoods, or from similarly difficult circumstances in Ireland or elsewhere, crossing, each morning, an invisible but absolute boundary between two versions of the same city that rarely acknowledged each other's existence directly, except through precisely the kind of household employment that put one woman's hands in another woman's hair every single night, without either of them ever fully entering the other's actual world. I think this contrast matters even within a story focused specifically on the concealments and burdens carried by women like Adelaide, because it would be dishonest to spend an entire evening discussing the exhaustions of extraordinary privilege without acknowledging, at least briefly, the far more severe and far less comfortable exhaustions being carried, at the very same hour, by women only a few streets away, women for whom concealment meant something considerably more urgent than a corset laced a half-inch tighter, women managing hunger, disease, dangerous working conditions, and a precariousness that made Adelaide's careful household ledger look, by comparison, like a game played with real but ultimately survivable stakes. Both kinds of burden were real, both deserve acknowledgement, but they were not by any honest measure equivalent, and I think tonight's story is more truthful for admitting that plainly, rather than suggesting that every woman of this era carried an equally weighted version of the same essential difficulty. The seasons themselves moved through this world with their own particular rhythm, one we have touched on throughout tonight, but that deserves, I think, one more moment of attention before we close. Winter in the city, the formal season proper, running roughly from November through Lent, packed with the balls and dinners and calls that structured Adelaide's days so completely. Then a quieter interval, Lent itself observed, even among families not especially devout, as a socially sanctioned period of reduced entertaining, a kind of collective, citywide exhale after months of relentless performance. Spring bringing the wedding season, exactly the kind of elaborate campaign we walked through with Charles's niece. Early summer, a brief return to the city before the wealthy departed almost entirely for Newport, Bar Harbor, or their own country estates, leaving Fifth Avenue itself strangely quiet through the hottest months. The great houses shuttered, their marble facades baking in a summer heat that none of the family remained to feel directly. And then, as September arrived and the city slowly refilled, the whole cycle beginning again. The same calendar, the same obligations, the same careful, constant labor of maintaining appearances, repeating itself year after year for the entire span of a woman's adult life. A wheel that never really stopped turning, that simply rotated through its same essential positions again and again, decade after decade, changing its specific fashions and its specific personalities, while the underlying structure remained, for the better part of half a century, remarkably constant. I find myself thinking, as we come toward the end of tonight's story, about how strange it is that a world built so entirely around permanence, around the appearance of unshakable, timeless stability, marble and gilt and old family names meant to suggest an order that would simply continue forever, turned out to be, in the end, a fairly brief historical moment, a few decades really compressed between the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of the First World War, before the whole elaborate structure began, gradually but unmistakably, to give way to something else entirely. The women who lived inside it, women like Adelaide, like Margaret, like Cornelia and Louisa and the others we have glimpsed tonight, experienced it, of course, as their entire world, the only reality available to them, permanent in the way that the present always feels permanent to the people actually living inside it, however temporary it eventually proves to have been from the vantage point of history looking backward. There is one more thread I want to pick back up before we let this story rest for the night, because I mentioned it earlier and let it sit unresolved, the way I told you at the start we sometimes would, and I think it deserves a proper return now. Earlier tonight, near the beginning of this story, I told you about the particular emotional temperature of that first dressing room scene, the tightened lacing, the exhale, the expression that crossed Adelaide's face in the mirror before she arranged it back into composure. I want to tell you now what I think that expression actually was, though I want to be honest that this is interpretation rather than certain fact, the kind of careful reading between the lines that any honest historian of this period eventually has to practice, because the women themselves so rarely left us the plain, unguarded record we might wish they had. I think it was fear, yes, that seems the most obvious reading, and it was plainly present. But I think sitting with it longer that it was also something closer to a kind of grief, a grief not exactly for the pregnancy itself, which she came in time to feel genuine joy about, but a grief for how she could not, in that moment, simply feel whatever she actually felt without first calculating what that feeling would cost her if anyone else ever glimpsed it. A grief for the specific, narrow room her own emotional life had been permitted to occupy since girlhood, a room she had furnished over the years with real friendship and real love and real moments of unguarded laughter, but a room nonetheless with walls she had never once in her entire adult life been permitted to test. Sitting with that expression, and with the photograph her granddaughter found decades later, the one of Adelaide and Margaret laughing together on a porch, entirely unguarded, entirely without performance, and I find myself hoping, in the way you hope for a person who existed once and can no longer answer for herself, that the distance between those two expressions, the composed fear in the mirror and the genuine unguarded laugh on the porch, represents something real about how a life can move, slowly, across enough years and enough trusted friendship, toward more room to simply be, even inside a world that offers, at the start, almost none at all. It is not something I know with any real certainty whether the actual women whose lives inform this composite story found that same movement toward more room in their own particular lives. Some did, plainly. The historical record gives us enough fragments to know that much. Others, I suspect, carried the full weight of that narrow room for their entire lives, without ever finding quite the release that Adelaide in this telling eventually found in her friendship with Margaret. That is simply the truth of history, uneven, incomplete, generous to some of its subjects and considerably less generous to others, for reasons that often had less to do with any individual woman's character or capability than with the simple arbitrary luck of which household she happened to be born into, which husband she happened to marry, which friend happened to sit beside her at exactly the right dinner table on exactly the right evening. What I can tell you with more confidence is this. Every woman who lived inside this world, whatever her particular fate, carried something of what we have discussed tonight. The constant vigilance, the careful management of appearance, the specific loneliness of being evaluated on labor that succeeded precisely by disappearing from view. And every one of them, whatever her particular fate, was also, underneath all of that, a genuine, complicated, feeling person, capable of real joy and real grief and real friendship, however narrow the room in which she was permitted to express any of it. I think that is worth remembering, worth carrying with you the next time you see one of those old photographs, the women in their formal gowns, composed, unsmiling, staring out at you across more than a century with an expression that reveals, quite deliberately, almost nothing at all. There was always more there. There was always a whole interior life, a whole private history of fear and courage and quiet, unrecorded labor, sitting just beneath that carefully arranged surface, waiting, in a sense, for someone, someday, to imagine it back into being. That is what we have tried to do together tonight, you and I. not to recover the literal, factual truth of any single woman's private thoughts, which the historical record simply does not allow us to do with any certainty, but to imagine our way back into the shape of what that world actually demanded and what it actually cost, honestly enough, carefully enough, that the woman in the portrait stops being simply a woman in a portrait and becomes instead, for a little while, someone whose exhaustion you can almost feel, whose quiet courage you can almost recognize, whose one unguarded laugh, captured by accident decades later, feels, by the time we reach it, like something genuinely worth arriving at. Let me leave you with a few last details before we close, small ones, the kind that do not fit neatly into any larger point, but that I think belong in tonight's story anyway, because I have found, across all the evenings we have spent together like this, that it is often the small, unresolved details that stay with a person longest, long after the larger arguments have faded. The garnet necklace, the real one, the one Adelaide kept rather than selling, eventually passed to her daughter, and then to a granddaughter, and as far as the fragmentary family record allows us to trace it, remains somewhere in the family even now, 130 years after it was first clasped around a young bride's neck on her wedding day, its stones considerably less valuable in strict market terms than they once were, but carrying, I think, a weight that has nothing to do with market value at all. Ellen, whose full story we will never fully recover, whose name in this telling stands in for dozens, hundreds of women whose actual names and actual lives have been lost almost entirely to the historical record, worked for Adelaide's household for a total of 19 years, by this composite account, before retiring in her middle 40s to a small house purchased with savings accumulated across nearly 2 decades of careful, disciplined thrift, a house Adelaide herself, in one of the few moments where the formal boundary between the two women's lives briefly, quietly softened, helped arrange the purchase of, a gesture that fell somewhere between employer's obligation and something closer to genuine, if carefully bounded affection between two women who had spent nearly 2 decades inside the same rooms, sharing, without ever fully acknowledging it to each other directly, more of each other's actual lives than either woman shared with almost anyone else. Margaret's Hudson Valley property, the one she offered Adelaide that morning over tea, the one that was never in the end actually needed for the purpose it had been offered for, remained in Margaret's family for 2 more generations, eventually sold in the 1950s as the broader pattern of these old family properties, expensive to maintain and increasingly disconnected from the social world that had originally justified their existence, gradually gave way, across the mid-20th century, to new owners, new uses, new versions of the same land that had once stood ready, quietly, as a place for a frightened young woman to disappear to if the arithmetic of her own particular crisis had worked out differently than it did. And the house itself, Adelaide and Charles's Fifth Avenue mansion, the one that hosted the April wedding, the one whose dressing room held every private hour we have spent tonight exploring, was demolished like so many of the great Gilded Age houses sometime in the 1930s, the land too valuable by that point to justify the enormous ongoing expense of maintaining a single-family residence of that scale, replaced, as so much of that stretch of Fifth Avenue eventually was, by an apartment building considerably more practical for the world that had, by then, entirely superseded the one we have spent this whole evening inside. Nothing physical remains of that particular dressing room, no photograph of it survives in any archive I have been able to trace. It exists now only in the kind of careful, composite imagining we have practiced together tonight, built from the pattern of dozens of similar rooms in dozens of similar houses, none of them Adelaide's exactly, all of them in the ways that matter most true. I think there is something fitting in that, actually. Something that returns us, gently, to where we started this whole evening. A room built entirely around concealment, a room whose entire purpose was to hold secrets that could never be spoken anywhere else, has itself become in the end a kind of secret physically erased from the world, survivable now only through careful, patient reconstruction, through exactly the kind of attention we have given it together tonight, You listening in the dark, me trying, as honestly as I can, to imagine my way back into a life that history recorded only in fragments, and that deserved, I think, considerably more than fragments. I want to spend just a little more time in the physical texture of that world before we close entirely, because I think there is comfort at this hour in simply resting inside detail for a while longer, without asking it to mean anything beyond itself. Think of the particular weight of a formal evening gown of this period, the layers involved, a chemise first, light cotton or fine linen against the skin, then the corset itself laced over that, then a corset cover, then perhaps one or two petticoats depending on the fullness the current fashion demanded, then the gown itself, often boned through the bodice in its own right, adding another layer of structure on top of everything the corset had already provided, the whole assembly weighing, by some contemporary accounts, 10 pounds or more once fully constructed, worn for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours across a single long evening, removed only in that quiet hour after midnight that we have returned to so many times tonight, piece by piece in the reverse order of its assembly, Ellen's hands moving through the same sequence she had performed thousands of times, until Adelaide stood, finally, in nothing but the light cotton chemise, the day's entire architecture of performance lying, discarded, across the back of a chair. Consider the particular sound a large house makes settling for the night, the specific creak of a particular floorboard in a particular hallway that every long-term resident of a house eventually learns so thoroughly they stop consciously hearing it at all, registering its absence, if it were somehow to go quiet, far more readily than its ordinary expected presence. Think of gaslight itself, the particular quality of it, warmer and less steady than the electric light that would eventually replace it across this same decade, throwing shadows that moved very slightly, almost imperceptibly, with each small fluctuation in the gas supply, giving even the stillest room a faint living quality that electric light, for all its brighter convenience, never quite replicated. Picture the smell of a well-run kitchen below stairs, even at this late hour, banked coals in the great iron range, the lingering trace of that evening's 11 courses, the specific mingled scent of a household that fed, on an ordinary week, not only the family upstairs but an entire staff of 10 or 12 or 15 people besides, an operation of genuine culinary scale conducted almost entirely out of sight, its success measured, like so much else in this world, by how completely it disappeared from the family's conscious awareness. A perfectly executed dinner, requiring no acknowledgement beyond a brief polite word to the housekeeper the following morning. Imagine, finally, the particular quality of a New York night in this specific decade, gas lamps and the newer electric lights mixing unevenly across the city depending on which streets had already been converted and which had not, horse-drawn carriages still considerably more common than the automobiles that would begin appearing in small, curious numbers, only toward the very end of this era, the specific sound of hooves on cobblestone, softer and more irregular than the sound modern ears associate with city traffic, the whole sensory landscape that has vanished now almost entirely, survivable only in exactly this way, through careful, patient, imaginative reconstruction, offered to you gently at the end of a long story, as one last set of images to carry with you into whatever comes next. I think, sitting with all of this together, the corsets and the calling cards and the tightened lacing and the burned letters and the garnet necklace and the photograph on the porch, that what we have really been exploring tonight is not simply a historical curiosity, interesting as I hope you have found it, but something closer to a portrait of what it costs a person to be loved and valued primarily for an appearance of effortlessness, rather than for the genuine, considerable effort that appearance actually requires. Adelaide's world asked her to be extraordinary and to make that extraordinariness look like nothing at all, to labour constantly and to let that labour vanish entirely from view, to feel deeply and completely, and to arrange her face always into an expression that revealed almost none of it. That is an enormous thing to ask of a person, across an entire lifetime, and I think it deserves, even now, even from this considerable distance, to be recognized clearly and held gently the way we have tried to hold it together across this whole long evening. There is one final image I want to leave with you before we close, and then I will let the story rest, and let you rest along with it. Picture one more time the dressing room, but this time picture it entirely empty, the way it would look now if it still existed, which of course it does not. The house itself demolished decades ago, replaced by an apartment building that has in its turn already stood for the better part of a century, housing lives that know nothing at all of the room that once occupied roughly that same patch of air, several stories up on a stretch of Fifth Avenue that has changed almost beyond recognition since the night we began this story. But imagine it anyway, empty, moonlit, the way rooms sometimes appear in memory even after the physical space itself has vanished entirely. The dressing table, the mirror, the single oil lamp, unlit now, cold, sitting exactly where it always sat. The wardrobe standing open, empty of the bronze silks and sea green gowns that once filled it. The hangers, if there were any left at all, swaying very slightly in a draught that no longer carries the specific mingled scent of cold cream and rosewater and coal smoke that once defined this particular room so completely. And somewhere in that emptiness, if you let yourself imagine carefully enough, the faint, lingering suggestion of a woman standing before that mirror, corset half-laced, eyes meeting her own reflection in a moment nobody else was ever meant to witness, an expression crossing her face that she would spend the rest of the night, the rest of the season, very possibly the rest of her life, working carefully to never let anyone see again. She is gone now, of course. Everyone in this story is gone now, Adelaide and Charles and Ellen and Margaret and Cornelia and Louisa and all the others we have glimpsed across this long evening. Gone the way everyone from that particular decade is now gone, their bodies returned to the ground decades ago, their names surviving, if they survive at all, only in the fragmentary way that most ordinary lives survive. A line in a family Bible, a photograph in a box in someone's attic, a garnet necklace passed down through hands that increasingly do not know the specific story of the woman who first wore it. But the shape of what she carried, I think, the particular weight of constant, invisible, unacknowledged labour, the particular loneliness of a life built around the successful concealment of one's own genuine feeling, the particular hard-won courage of managing crisis after crisis without ever once being permitted to simply say, honestly, that the managing was difficult. That shape, I think, has not entirely disappeared. Even now, even in a world that has changed as completely as ours has changed from Adelaide's, it shows up still, in different costumes, in different rooms, in the lives of people carrying their own versions of the same essential burden. And I think there is something worth carrying with you into your own sleep tonight, in simply having spent this evening paying close, careful attention to one particular composite version of it, imagined as honestly and as gently as I know how to imagine it. That is where I want to leave you tonight, in that empty room, moonlit, quiet, holding gently the memory of a woman who was never quite as visible in her own lifetime as she deserved to be, and who is perhaps just a little more visible now, having spent this evening together in your company, than she has been in a very long time. Before I let the story fully close, I want to circle back once more to something we touched on early tonight, because I think it deserves a final, gentler pass now that you know the whole shape of Adelaide's life, now that the 11 weeks and the April wedding and the porch photograph and the empty moonlit room have all had their chance to settle properly into your thinking. We began this evening by noticing a paradox. The tighter the lacing, the safer the secret. And the safer the secret, the more perfect the appearance. And the more perfect the appearance, the more completely alone the woman wearing it became. I want to tell you now that this paradox, real as it was never quite the whole truth of Adelaide's life, even in its most difficult season. Because alongside the isolation, running parallel to it the entire time, there was also Ellen's steady, wordless presence in that same room, dressing her every single day for 19 years. There was Margaret, understanding everything without requiring explanation, offering a quiet countryside sanctuary over a cup of tea that had nothing at all to do with the charity committee it was ostensibly discussing. There was Charles, imperfect and formal and shaped by all the limitations of his own particular upbringing, but capable, when it finally mattered most, of receiving difficult news with more grace than 12 years of careful management had ever quite prepared her to expect. There was her own daughter, raised inside the same system but given, in small deliberate ways, a little more room than Adelaide herself had received. And there was, finally, that one unguarded photograph on a porch somewhere, decades later, proof that whatever this world had taken from her across all those years of careful performance, it had never quite managed to take everything. I think that is worth remembering this late in the evening, because it would be too simple, too neat, to end a story like this one purely on its sorrow, and I do not think that would honour Adelaide, or Ellen, or Margaret, or any of the women whose composite lives have carried us through tonight's long, slow journey. Their world was genuinely difficult, in ways we have spent hours now carefully documenting, but it was also somehow, alongside all of that difficulty, a world in which real love persisted, real friendship held, real moments of unguarded joy occasionally, unexpectedly broke through the careful architecture of performance that governed almost everything else. Both things were true at once, the difficulty and the tenderness, the isolation and the connection, and I think the fullest, most honest way to hold this history is to let both of those truths sit together, without insisting that one must cancel the other out. You have been very patient with me tonight, staying with this story through all of its careful historical detail, its calling cards and its corsets and its coded conversations over tea, and I am grateful for that patience, genuinely, the way I am grateful every single night for whoever happens to be listening on the other side of this quiet, one-directional conversation we have together. I hope wherever you are, in whatever room, at whatever hour this particular story happens to be reaching you, that you are warm and comfortable and further towards sleep now than you were when we began. Let the dressing room close now, gently, the way a door closes at the end of a long evening, softly, without any hurry at all. Let the lamp go out. Let the house settle fully into its long, quiet night, the way it did in reality, thousands and thousands of times across all the years we have just spent together tracing through one particular composite version of it. Adelaide is sleeping now, wherever she is, in whatever form a story like this one allows a person to keep sleeping, decades and decades after her actual life came to its actual end. And I think at this hour it might be time for you to do the same. Feel your own breathing slow now, the way it probably already has, a little, without your quite noticing. Let your shoulders release whatever they have been quietly holding all day, the way Adelaide's own shoulders, I imagine, finally released each night, once Ellen had gone, once the lamp was out, once the whole enormous weight of the day's performance had finally, completely been set down. You do not have to hold anything right now. You do not have to manage anything, or conceal anything, or perform anything at all for anyone. You are simply here, in the dark, warm, comfortable, listening to the last soft edges of a story that has, I hope, carried you gently toward exactly where you needed to be. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight, in a room that no longer exists, with a woman who never quite existed either, not exactly, and yet somehow, across this whole long evening together, felt, I hope, entirely real to you anyway. That is, in the end, the whole quiet purpose of stories like this one. Rest now. I will be here again next time, whenever you need somewhere else to go to fall asleep. Good night.